I think some of the leaders of the anti-vaccine movement, such as RFK, have blood on his hands. He traveled to Samoa in 2019 and convinced a lot of people there. And there was an outbreak immediately afterwards, and 50 kids died. So this is not just...
Of what disease was that?
Measles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, wherever he goes, measles follows. So he was active trying to convince Somali immigrants in Minnesota not to vaccinate their children, and he was successful.
What's up, people? Today we are talking with Dr. Jonathan Howard. He is a neurologist and vaccine advocate here in New York City and has agreed to speak with me regarding the vaccine topic that is dominating our culture today. I'll be honest, I, like a lot of people, listened to the RFK episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, and Robert Kennedy was saying a lot of really scary and concerning things regarding the vaccine and childhood vaccine, COVID vaccines, all sorts of stuff that I didn't understand, and it was really, really weird and confusing for me. So I decided to find an expert that could answer all of my questions, and I'm so grateful that Dr. Howard sat down with me today to answer everything that I had to ask. He was able to explain everything in a very clear and concise way, and I feel like I have a fuller understanding of sort of the miscommunication that's happening in culture today and sort of like where the major points are that I think people are missing. I learned a lot through this conversation, so I hope you guys do as well. Without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Dr. Howard. Welcome to camp. So obviously I found you through Twitter and through reading some of your blogs and some of your conversations you were having with people on Twitter, specifically in relation to the conversation that Joe Rogan and RFK Jr. had recently relating to vaccines, both childhood vaccines, but also the COVID vaccine. And you had a lot of really interesting points kind of pointing to the efficacy and advocating for vaccines at large. And I listened to the RFK episode and was concerned. I listened to it and I was like, he's saying a lot of very scary things. I'm listening and I'm like, this is crazy. Why is no one talking about this? And so I started Googling and trying to find answers, and I just figured what better way to learn what's going on than talk to someone that is an expert in the field.
Sounds good.
Would you mind just giving me just like a little bit of a background on like your professional work? I know you're not obviously like a vaccine developer. You don't work within a pharmaceutical company. So some of your answers to some of these questions will be contextualized through that. So would you mind just explaining sort of what your professional background is?
Yeah, so I'm a neurologist and a psychiatrist at NYU and Bellevue Hospital here in New York City. The main disease that I treat is multiple sclerosis. Has nothing to do with infectious disease, nothing to do with vaccine preventable diseases.
Right.
Although maybe I take that back because over the pandemic, it was recently revealed that the cause of MS, or at least a cause of it, is infection with Epstein-Barr virus. So maybe a lot of diseases that we never thought of vaccine preventable might turn out to be. But I digress.
Interesting.
So I have been very interested in vaccines for about the past decade or so. When a woman that I trained with, a doctor by the name of Kelly Brogan, morphed into one of the country's most outspoken anti-vaccine doctors. So I worked with her at Bellevue and NYU. We trained together. She was nice. She was smart. She was reasonable when she actually had to treat patients. But she has since retired from the practice of medicine in her 30s and has become sort of a full-time guru, online speaker, online salesman. And shortly after she graduated, she started posting anti-vaccine content on Facebook, which is how a lot of people got radicalized into the movement. And when I initially encountered some of her posts, I didn't know how to refute them, but I was very curious. And I've spent the past decade before the pandemic learning everything that I could about the anti-vaccine movement and how to refute their ideas. I was never really interested in vaccines per se, which one is live activated, which one is inactivated, which one has this antigen and this antigen. That never really interested me. But what I was interested in is what led smart, competent people like my old friend, Dr. Brogan, who went to MIT, who went to Cornell and trained with me at NYU, to embrace quackery, to reject probably the single most life-saving treatment in the history of medicine.
And have you ever spoken with her personally relating to her ideas regarding vaccines?
No, she's not a big fan of mine, probably to the extent that she thinks about me much at all. And we really couldn't have much of a conversation. It would be like trying to have a conversation with someone who, if someone who lived 1,000 years ago was transported forward in time, and trying to have a conversation with them about how the internet should be regulated. It just really wouldn't go anywhere, because in order to have a discussion and a debate with certain people, you have to agree on certain core facts. And she is a germ theory denialist, by which she means viruses do not cause disease. So she does not believe that HIV causes AIDS. She does not believe SARS-CoV-2 causes COVID. So we really couldn't get off the ground by having any sort of conversation. I will say this, she, like most of the doctors who I discuss in my writing, is very sheltered from the consequences of her words. So for example, when there was a measles outbreak here in 2019 in New York City, she was never at the bedside treating any of those patients. I should add, I wasn't either. I'm not a pediatrician, but I've treated patients with vaccine-preventable diseases. By far and away, the most common one is shingles, a complication of varicella zoster virus, which causes chickenpox. But I've seen that cause strokes. I've seen that cause blindness. I've seen that cause spinal inflammation, transverse myelitis. So at least I have some responsibility for the consequences of my words.
Right. That makes sense. So let's make some consensus then. Can you explain to me what is a vaccine? And I think a lot of people, when they think about vaccines, they think, okay, I got them when I was a kid. I get a flu shot every now and again. And then I think COVID really kind of like changed a lot of people's opinions and really polarized a lot of people in regards to the vaccine debate. So generally speaking, what are the vaccines that RFK is talking about when he's talking about like childhood vaccines? What are they and what is the purpose of them?
Yeah, so the word vaccine comes from, the Latin for vacca, cow, which is a reference to the first vaccination by not by Edward Jenner, believe it or not. He stole from milkmaids. That's probably a myth, actually, but farmers in England knew that milkmaids were protected from smallpox. And so basically a vaccine is an attempt to, I was going to say trick your immune system, but that isn't right, but to induce an immune response against an antigen that is not the disease, but is similar enough to an actual virus or bacteria, so that when your body encounters that virus or that bacteria for real, your immune system has already been primed and is ready to fight it. It's a way of creating immunity without getting sick, without getting the disease itself.
Right. Now, when RFK was talking to Joe, he had mentioned that a lot of the vaccines before had contained mercury, and that there were two different types of mercury, and there was a specific type contained within the vaccine, and that the purpose was that the vaccine basically requires like preservatives in order to like preserve the antigen within it, and then also an agitator effectively that's able to create an immune response that then is able to create vaccine uptake. Now, why was there mercury in some of the vaccines, and is that harmful to people if they're getting vaccinated?
Yeah, so there was never mercury in vaccines. There was a mercury salt called thimerosal. Hopefully I'm pronouncing some of these things right. I've realized since I've been doing a couple of podcasts, so there's a lot of words I've only written before.
I did that with homage. I was like, homage. Okay. That just proves you read, really. If you mispronounce words, it proves you're a reader.
Correct, yeah. But anyway, so this was a preservative which was used in certain multi-dose vaccines. So in other words, if let's say you're going to give 10 children a vaccine, you can draw from the same vial. And this was used to help keep those vials sterile. And there's a big difference between elemental mercury, the thing that's in thermometers, and mercury compounds. The best way to think about this is sodium chloride. If you take a rock of pure sodium, it's a metal, and throw it in water, it will explode. If you take chlorine, it's a toxic gas. You mix them together, you get table salt. Or the difference between hydrogen or water, H2O, and hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, one molecule can make a big difference. So thimerosal was a mercury-containing salt, I believe.
Got it.
And there was a theory that it was linked to autism. And there was never any evidence for this, but out of an abundance of caution, it was removed from all childhood vaccines in 2001. And so how did the anti-vaccine movement react to this? Did they say, oh, the fact that autism rates did not plummet once this was removed from childhood vaccines, therefore vaccines don't cause autism? No, they just moved on to a different vaccine, namely the MMR, which never contained thimerosal. And I should say that this had the effect of making vaccines more expensive, because instead of shipping them in multi-dose vials, every single vaccine was in a single-dose vial. So it really increased the cost of vaccines as well.
Did it make them safer?
It did not make them safer. There's no evidence that it made them safer. There's no evidence that thimerosal ever caused any sort of neurological complications. And either way, it's been out of vaccines for 20 years. So it's a historical oddity at this point, and it's probably never coming back. But this just shows that anti-vaccine zombie myths never die. and it's much easier to scare people than it is to unscare them.
Right. Now, I understand that some of the vaccines that contain mercury, as the mercury was removed or thimerosal was removed, it was replaced with aluminum or some type of aluminum substance or aluminum compound, something.
Yeah.
What is that, and is that dangerous?
So same thing. It's aluminum salts. I think maybe I misspoke when I said the mercury compound was a salt. Anyways, doesn't really matter, but it was a compound. It was not elemental mercury. And so there are aluminum salts as well. And those are used to help trigger an immune response to make the vaccine more effective. But there's same thing. These things have been studied copiously, and there's no evidence that they cause the diseases that they are trying to prevent. There's no evidence that they lead to autism or any neurological problems in children. And this data does not just come from the CDC or the FDA. It comes from international studies. It comes from the UK. It comes from Denmark. It comes from Asian countries as well. Probably no topic in medicine has been investigated more than the lack of a link between vaccines and autism.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, the international component that this goes on. Because obviously in America, people point at like the pharmaceutical industry, and we can get to that within the United States. But obviously every other country has different levels of infrastructure when it comes to medicine. And there's some countries that I'm sure are similar to America. They get the same vaccine schedule. And then there's other countries that probably get a reduced vaccine schedule. Do you notice any disparity between like autism rates in different countries as they relate to vaccines? Or has that ever been brought up within like the anti-vax community in a way that you've seen?
Probably it has, because they'll look for any sort of evidence that vaccines cause autism. But there's some confounders there in that countries that are going to have access to high vaccination rates are probably going to have higher doses, more robust systems for diagnosing autism. In that, if you look at some of the countries that are resource poor, rural Afghanistan, for example, their rates of picking up and diagnosing autism and reporting autism and recording autism are probably not going to be as sensitive as ours.
Sure.
But certainly countries in Western Europe have investigated this as well and have found no link between vaccines and autism. And I think at this point, we have to say vaccines don't cause autism. And there was never really any evidence for this. It was a myth started by Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who got struck off. He was caught basically faking data. And there was never any plausible biological mechanism by which vaccines might cause autism any more than roller skating might cause brain cancer. I mean, one could say there's never been a study of roller skating and brain cancer. Maybe roller skating causes brain cancer. My friend roller skated and got brain cancer. But there's never been a plausible biological mechanism by which that could happen.
And now when Andrew Wakefield wrote sort of his findings, I think he published it in the Lancet,
Correct.
I believe. Why was it accepted, and why did he fabricate or allegedly fabricate his findings? Do you know what the reason was?
Well, there's an investigative journalist, Brian Deere, who looked into this and found that he was trying to market his own measles vaccine potentially, rather than having it be combined with other vaccines as well. So he was suggesting that Dr. Wakefield was trying to promote his own vaccine.
Interesting.
And he became sort of a hero to the anti-vaccine movement. He still is. He's still widely regarded as their sort of founder, so to speak. And I made the analogy between roller skating and brain cancer, and maybe that sounded a little dismissive because a lot of parents did notice that their children started to develop signs of autism very shortly after they received vaccines. So, one wasn't, I don't want to dismiss that, and I don't want to mock parents who've had that experience, but that just happens to be the time that around the time that children are receiving a lot of their vaccines is around the time that the symptoms of autism first starts to manifest. But they have done studies even in newborns, I think MRI studies. Boy, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself or outside of my scope of knowledge here. But in other words, the signs of autism can be seen in children before they are vaccinated, in certain children when you go back and look retroactively.
Right.
So the idea that vaccines might cause autism shouldn't have been dismissed, and it wasn't dismissed. As I said, few things have been studied more in medicine than the non-link between vaccines and autism.
Because autism, I understand, has like a behavioral diagnosis around like 2 years old. roughly. I don't know if that's exactly true, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, because that's when children first start to speak. That's really one of the first manifestations.
And I guess there's another round of vaccines that children get around 2 years old, around the same time. And so historically, parents have felt that there was a causal link between those two things. And obviously, we've heard accounts of parents who children are hitting all of their developmental marking points, where they're exceeding marks, where toilet training, speaking, walking, things like that. They'll get vaccinated. That night, they'll have a fever due to the inflammation from the vaccine. And then, a week later, they're now regressing in their development.
Yeah, and those sorts of stories are very compelling because you have a sympathetic parent, you have a child who is suffering in some way, and it's just very hard to break that connection in people's mind. But I want to say as well that a lot of parents of children with autism or people with autism are very unhappy with the anti-vaccine movement, and they do not feel that leaving children vulnerable to dangerous diseases in their name has done the autism community a service.
Right.
And they feel that an enormous amount of time and money has been wasted repeatedly showing that there's no link between vaccines and autism. And these studies don't change anyone's mind at this point anymore. There's really no study that could be done which would dissuade certain parents or doctors from believing that vaccines cause autism. It's always do one more study, do one more study, do one more study, and then those studies get done and they don't change anyone's mind at this point. So a lot of people within the autism community, I'm not a representative of them, I don't speak for them, but they're very unhappy that they've been used this way and that resources have been diverted where they could have gone to other better things.
Right. Yeah, I've had autistic friends mention things like that to me, where they're like, it is annoying that people would rather have their kid get a potentially debilitating illness or die than be like me.
Yeah.
And it's hurtful is what they've mentioned.
Right. And so sometimes it's seen as this sort of David versus Goliath. On the one hand, you have the CDC, the FDA, and Pfizer, and these big soulless, companies and institutions and bureaucrats. And on the other side, you have these poor, suffering parents who are out there by themselves, and these brave, maverick doctors who are willing to risk everything to challenge the status quo. And there's some truth to that. Pfizer is a big gazillion-dollar pharmaceutical company. But the anti-vaccine movement can be very profitable as well. I think people like RFK Jr. and Andrew Wakefield have done quite well for themselves by promoting anti-vaccine myths. I don't want to say that everyone is motivated by that, but the idea that it's this sort of David versus Goliath is not the case. And certainly there's a very well-organized anti-vaccine movement that was even gearing to fight up COVID vaccines before there were COVID vaccines. They were organizing as early as February 2020 to fight the COVID vaccines. And they had already started spreading myths about them before any data was released. And the same was true of the pediatric COVID vaccine. There was a movement to oppose vaccinating children before a single data point on the vaccine had been released.
And you would suggest that there's a financial incentive on the other side as well, to probably not to the same degree as a pharmaceutical company, but an individual could profit a lot from having an anti-vaccine approach.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of individual anti-vaxxers have monetized Substacks, monetized YouTubes. They've made profitable movies. A lot of anti-vaccine doctors sell supplements or online courses. So it's unusual to find a prominent anti-vaccine advocate who isn't also selling something. There are some. But the idea that conflicts of interest are only on one side is just not true.
That makes sense. Now, as far as the vaccine causing inflammation, I've heard parents mention, my child got vaccinated, and then that night they had a fever, they were sweating, they were having, they were vomiting, things like that. Can you speak to the inflammatory properties of some vaccines and some of the adverse reactions that some people may have?
Well, we've all gotten vaccines, and we all know that they do cause inflammation, especially locally. We have a sore arm. Certain people can feel quite sick the next day. I felt a little sick after my COVID shot. Some people feel quite sick. So that's just your body having a natural immune response. So sometimes vaccines are considered to be not natural. They are the opposite is considered natural immunity when you get sick with measles or chickenpox and gain immunity that way.
Right.
But the immune response induced by vaccines is completely natural. So it's not surprising that, matter of fact, it would be worrisome in some ways if you gave a vaccine and it did not cause symptoms of inflammation, fever, pain, redness, soreness, tenderness, etc. That's a natural response. And you hope that it's going to be much, 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 much less than what a self-replicating virus would do within your body.
So biologically, what happens after a vaccine is injected and after a live virus is caught, you would say is functionally the same thing, generally speaking, in terms of building immunity?
Yeah, that's the goal. There are certain vaccines that may not give quite as good immunity as infection itself. I'm trying to think of some examples off the top of my head, but either way, if that's the case, by getting the vaccine instead of getting the virus, you get the immunity without getting the disease. Mm-hmm. So using a virus to gain immunity to it is kind of like using pregnancy as a form of contraception. It works. A pregnant woman can't get pregnant, but there's a catch.
Right. Yeah, literally. You have to catch something. And exactly so right. As far as, there's obviously a lot of different vaccines that we're talking about, right? Like when people say vaccine, there's not a singular thing. There's a lot of different types, and people are given a lot of different vaccines. So do you believe that all vaccines are generally as safe as others as far as like the scheduled childhood vaccine regimen?
I think so. I'm trying to think, what are some of the worst side effects that can be caused by vaccines? And there are some cases, 1 in 500 million potentially of the measles vaccine causing encephalitis. I mean, ultra rare. Mm-hmm. Probably the most dangerous vaccine that I can think of might be the smallpox vaccine, which is no longer in use. The major vaccine that is dangerous that is still in use is probably the oral polio vaccine. We don't get that here in the United States, but mm-hmm. that can revert occasionally, like 1 in a million, to the virulent form and cause the disease polio itself.
Is that a live vaccine?
That's a live vaccine. That's I believe it is, yes. That's the only one of the vaccines that I can think of. But the vaccine schedule is incredibly safe and has been studied more than just about anything in medicine. Now, an anti-vaccine advocate in front of me would say they would argue against me by saying there has never been a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of the entire vaccine schedule.
Right. RFK mentioned that.
Yeah. So it's worth thinking about what that study how would you do that study?
And can you just describe what a double-blind placebo study is?
Sure. So this is how almost all vaccines were studied, including the COVID vaccines, and I was in one. So basically, what happened is I showed up, they flipped a coin, they injected me with a vaccine or a placebo, and they didn't tell me what I was getting. The person injecting me didn't tell me what I was getting, and I didn't find out until the study ended. I knew that I got the vaccine because I had a sore arm, I had a fever. So, I mean, I shouldn't say I knew, but I was pretty confident because I felt that.
Otherwise, the placebo is strong.
Yeah,
in that case.
But that happens. If you look at the side effect list of placebo in these studies, it's not benign. Mm-hmm. Anyways, but I was pretty sure I was right, and I was. But anyway, so what they do is they give 20,000 people placebo. They give 20,000 people, sometimes they don't, it's not 50-50, but 20,000 people the actual vaccine, and they wait and see who gets the disease. And that's how they know vaccines work. Now, it is true that there has never been a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial of the entire vaccine schedule. But this is a very common anti-vaccine technique to call for studies that would literally be impossible to do. So in other words, would you be able to find any parent who would let their child be randomized to receive the MMR or the polio vaccine or the pertussis vaccine or placebo? No.
Right.
So no parent would enroll their child in that study. No ethical doctor would participate in that study. All medical research is overseen by boards called institutional review boards, whose job it is to make sure that unethical studies are not done and to make sure that subjects in research trials are protected. So no IRB would agree to such a study. And how long would the study last? Would you have to wait and see whether the unvaccinated group or the vaccinated group got Alzheimer's disease at a higher rate. So if you took a newborn baby today, would the study have to last 80 years before we find out whether the vaccines cause or prevent Alzheimer's disease, for example? So it's just literally an impossible study. But by calling for impossible studies and making them sound reasonable, they seek and they do create doubt, because they can say, we both agree that randomized double-blind placebo-controlled style studies are the gold standard of evidence, and you are against doing the gold standard of evidence. You are, what person in their right mind could be opposed to more research or more studies? But that's the issue. If I could instantly whip up such a study in a world with unlimited time, unlimited money, mostly unlimited ethics, sure, why not do that study? But in the real world, you can't leave hundreds of thousands of children vulnerable to measles, polio, pertussis, HPV, chickenpox, et cetera, without a lot of them suffering.
Yeah, that's a tricky conundrum. I can understand the challenge where it's like, an anti-vaccine parent wouldn't want their children to randomly potentially get a vaccine, and pro-vaccine parents wouldn't want their children to potentially get a placebo. So it creates a real conundrum, but it does put the vaccine in a innocent until proven guilty sort of paradigm, where the assumption is that it is life-saving and good, and not getting it would therefore be bad. Well, is there a precedent for that within the scientific community?
Well, I will say this: individual vaccines are studied that way.
Oh, in what way?
Randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials. What RFK Jr. is saying is that the entire vaccine schedule hasn't been studied that way. So they will say, for example, oh, sure, you can show me a trial of the HPV vaccine in a randomized trial. You can show me a trial of the polio vaccine. You can show me a trial of the MMR vaccine, but you can't show me a trial of the HPV, polio, MMR, all of the vaccines combined.
I see.
So individually, vaccines are studied that way, with a handful of exceptions. So, for example, if a vaccine has been proven to be safe and effective in adults, for example, occasionally it will be given to teenagers on the basis of whether it can generate an immune response. For example, there's a very small number of vaccines which have been licensed that way. But it's kind of like saying, if we do a study of people after they've had 10 shots of whiskey and driving, do we really need to do a study of people who've had 10 shots of rum and driving? So
I see.
So there have been a handful of vaccines, which are probably not ones that we get in the U.S. Maybe I think a flu vaccine, maybe a cholera or a dengue fever vaccine.
I see.
And I should say, there's a ton of vaccines that we don't get here in the United States. I just listed some. We don't get cholera, we don't get dengue fever, we don't get the yellow fever vaccine, and of course we don't get the smallpox vaccine. So the Ebola vaccine. So we are not getting vaccinated for diseases that do not pose a threat to us.
That makes sense.
For the most part.
So generally speaking, individualized vaccines within the vaccine schedule, like measles, obviously
Correct.
that is within the MMR vaccine, but the measles vaccine individually, was that double-blind placebo tested?
Yeah, in the 1960s, I'd have to look up the original trial, but yeah.
And then I've heard that there's been, conflicting reports as far as the testing goes when it comes to combining vaccines. So the MMR vaccine being measles, mumps, and rubella. I was reading that individually they might be tested, but then together the double-blind placebo studies are not as widely tested. Is there any credence to that idea?
Again, there is. I'd have to look up, to be totally honest with you, see whether the MMR vaccine was tested or if all three individual components were. But randomized placebo-controlled trials are not the only way that we can gain evidence. As a matter of fact, they are inferior to other trial designs for learning about certain sorts of things. So most randomized placebo-controlled trials are relatively small. It's hard to get hundreds of thousands of people to enroll in trials.
Right. Yeah. You need statistical significance with these trials.
Correct. And so there have been, the original polio trials were like the largest trials ever done were like 600,000 or 700,000 kids. I mean, they were sort of this enormous thing. But I don't know if that could happen today because I'm not sure parents would be willing to enroll their children in vaccine trials. I mean, there was a whole movement then with the March of Dimes, and this was like a national moonshot campaign type thing. And at least for something like COVID, there's a real cost to waiting. It's not like time is an unlimited asset in the middle of a pandemic. But we can learn about these vaccines through other methods. So there are many, many, many things that have never been studied in a randomized controlled trial, like cigarettes. So if you think cigarettes cause cause cancer, smoking
they definitely cause smoking. You have some cigarettes in your pocket, you get a couple drinks, you're smoking.
But that's never been studied in a randomized controlled trial. No virus has ever been studied in a randomized controlled trial. So when we say to ourselves that COVID is more dangerous for older people than younger people, which it absolutely is, but that we didn't learn that from a randomized controlled trial. So we're able to learn things about medicine outside of randomized controlled trials, and there's whole hosts of other trials, cohort, case control, et cetera, which are used to answer certain questions.
Yeah, I want to ask about that, but also I'm curious with the placebo trials. I've read that some of the placebos won't necessarily be saline, that some of the vaccine placebos will be everything else that is in the vaccine with the omission of the antigen.
Yeah.
So it might contain, like the aluminum salts or some of the other preservatives. And people have pointed out that those studies may be less effective because it might be those agitators that are actually causing the encephalopathy.
Yes. But there are saline trials.
Oh, there are?
There are.
Okay.
Of a decent number of vaccines.
Okay.
Absolutely. But this is one technique of the anti-vaccine movement is they will always sort of say, one more study will assuage my fears. Just do one more study. Just do one more study.
Right.
And it's this unlimited request for studies until we do the study of 1 million kids who are half vaccinated, half unvaccinated, and we follow them for the next 80 years. That would shut the debate down. But it wouldn't then because...
Yeah, there might be another thing.
Correct.
It's also important, I guess, to recognize that like a lot of the I guess, fervence for the movement is coming from a place of trauma. Right, like as you mentioned before, like if these parents have children with autism or or autism spectrum disorder, that they have a lot of emotional baggage related to the cause. So obviously people can't reason themselves out of a position they didn't reason themselves into.
Correct.
And so yeah, I understand why it's a really like complicated emotional challenge, especially to try to educate people.
Yeah, and I think that this is why we have to approach people who are against vaccines for the most part with empathy and warmness and understanding. They're not bad people, with a few exceptions. I think some of the leaders of the anti-vaccine movement, such as RFK, have blood on his hands. He traveled to Samoa in 2019 and convinced a lot of people there. He met with local anti-vaccine leaders in the island of Samoa, and there was an outbreak immediately afterwards, and 50 kids died. So this is not just...
Of what disease was that?
Measles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, wherever he goes, measles follows. So he was active trying to convince Somali immigrants in Minnesota not to vaccinate their children, and he was successful. Here in our measles outbreak in 2019, which was centered in the Hasidic community, I don't know if he was directly involved, but other luminaries of the anti-vaccine movement were active in that community and successfully convinced parents not to vaccinate their children. And the result was children in the ICU. None died, fortunately. And so I think we have to be sympathetic to parents who have been tricked, or certainly parents who feel that their children have been affected by vaccines. But we don't need to extend that same grace to leaders of the anti-vaccine movement, people who lie for profit and attention.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there's people with, I think, malignant intentions across the spectrum, but obviously within the anti-vaccine movement, I think that's pretty clear. And something that anti-vaccine advocates, and I think RFK brought this up as well, was the diphtheria vaccine that was controversial. I think it was popular in like the 70s and then was eventually pulled because there was some adverse effects. Can you speak to that?
So I think you're talking about the pertussis vaccine, actually.
Yeah, DPT.
Yeah. So there was a cellular pertussis vaccine. So now we get the DTaP, which I think the A stands for acellular. And if I recall my history, boy, I haven't thought about this in a while. but the pertussis vaccine, the cellular pertussis vaccine, just caused a lot of febrile seizures, if I recall. I'm going to have to look that up and maybe edit the podcast. But
sure. No, that's fine.
And it was taken off the market for that reason. It was replaced by an acellular pertussis vaccine. But this should just show that vaccine safety. All of this should show that thimerosal was taken off the market. Is taken extremely seriously, that with the slightest hint, even the possibility that there could be a severe reaction, that these vaccines are taken off the market. This also happened with the rotavirus vaccine. So rotavirus is a diarrheal illness that killed several hundred children per year, not in the United States as much as other resource-poor countries. And an early version of that was found to cause intussusception, which is an intestinal problem. And it was taken off the market for a while and reformulated. So vaccine safety is taken very seriously. And the fact that vaccines occasionally get taken off the market or repurposed and reformulated should give parents confidence rather than used as sort of a gotcha.
Right, yeah. That is an interesting point, that if there was a nefarious cabal of people trying to injure your children that was being covered up by the government, why would they make slight modifications to, this thing that they're trying to hurt you with?
Yes.
Like if there's bullets that I'm shooting at you, like why would I slightly change them to make them less effective, right? Like if the purpose is to try to maim you.
And just think about the amount of people that would have to be quiet for this conspiracy theory, for some of these conspiracy theories to be true. I mean, consider the fact that Donald Trump couldn't hide the fact that he had documents in his bathroom,
right.
Or that Bill Clinton couldn't cover up a blowjob in the Oval Office.
Right.
So the most powerful men on the planet couldn't hide damaging, embarrassing information about them coming forward. So this idea that there's some sort of massive vaccine autism cover-up, which has been postulated, just really doesn't hold water.
Now, when it comes to the double-blind studies, obviously there's some ethical concerns with not prescribing children with medication. Is it possible to do retroactive studies with populations that haven't been vaccinated due to class or geographical issues, or even just within the anti-vax community?
Yeah, so that's what I was talking about there are other design studies that have been done. Simply put, are children who have been vaccinated, do they have a higher rate of autism? And the answer to that is no. And data from this comes from multiple different countries and multiple different time points, is that children who receive the MMR vaccine do not have a higher rate of autism than children who did not receive the MMR vaccine. The last study to look at this was very recent in 2019. It was out of Denmark. It was hundreds of thousands of children, and it found no link. And again, the anti-vaxxers will then sort of say, okay, fine, maybe the MMR doesn't cause autism, but the MMR combined with all the other vaccines does cause autism. So again, it's just this one more study that hasn't been done.
That's interesting. And that study itself basically just looked at a whole sample of vaccinated and unvaccinated regarding to specifically the MMR and didn't find any significant statistical difference.
Correct.
Interesting.
And there have been dozens of these studies from around the world at this point.
Interesting. And as far as like some of the other studies that you mentioned, do you know like what these studies are that use like saline versus like the actual like live antigen, or any of those off the top of your head?
I would have to look them up, but
totally
I could.
Fine. Okay.
I mean, people have compiled these lists because these are old anti-vaccine talking points.
Right.
So I'm sure in the notes of the program.
Yeah, we can put that in the description.
Yeah. So there definitely have been studies versus saline placebo. Those absolutely have existed.
Right. If I'm thinking of it, I'm sure a doctor's probably right. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because you need an attorney. And I want to tell you about the greatest personal injury law firm to ever exist. And those are the good people at Morgan & Morgan. Yeah, that's right. Let's say you slipped, you fell. Say you got rear-ended. Let's say you got rickets. I don't know. Maybe someone gave it to you. Maybe you got shingles. I don't even know if you can sue for chlamydia. I don't know the laws around that type of thing. But I know who does. And those are the good people at Morgan & Morgan. This is why I trust Morgan & Morgan, and you could too. They are the largest personal injury law firm in the country. Yeah, 100 offices, 800 attorneys. And this is the greatest thing about them, okay? So first off, they're trusted. That's a fact, all right? Secondly, it's so easy to submit a claim. 8 clicks or less. You can go on their website. You don't have to go through all these pages of sketchy attorneys, people you don't even know. You're going through all these pages. Like, you're like, who is this guy? This guy's going to rip me off. It is so hard to find an attorney, especially as a young dude. I'm like, I don't know anything about law. I don't know how to find someone. But here's what's nice about Morgan & Morgan. 8 clicks or less, and you could submit a claim. Yeah. 8 clicks or less. It's amazing. It's like ordering food. It's like ordering something off like Amazon. It's easy. It's simple. You don't have to call a bunch of random numbers, get put through to a secretary that doesn't give a shit. It's very simple. And then here's the other amazing thing. It's free unless you win. That's right. I'm sure you're thinking, oh, if the service is so good and they're so trusted, it's going to cost me an absolute fortune just to have them look at my claim. Hey, they don't charge you a single thing unless they win your case. It's a pretty good deal. You pay $0 unless they win your case. So if you're ever injured, you could check out Morgan & Morgan. Their fee is free unless they win. For more information, go to forthepeople, forthepeople.com/Gagnon. That is forthepeople.com/Gagnon, Gagnon, or dial pound law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone. Stop blowing all your stacks. All right. You don't got to blow your stacks. So if you're ever injured, that's forthepeople, forthepeople.com/Gagnon, Gagnon, or dial pound law, pound 529 from your cell phone. Now let's get back to the show. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because I got to tell you about one of the most interesting, innovative devices I've ever seen. Okay. Now let me just paint it this way. Look, quitting a habit can be extremely difficult, especially a bad habit. Trying to stop all of your bad habits is very tough. I've done it before, and it's not always the easiest thing, okay? Trying to go cold turkey is very challenging, and that's why I've decided to try to turn my bad habits into just habits. Yeah, I'm taking the bad out of the habit, and that's why I want to tell you about Fume. Fume is really interesting. It's this innovative little device, okay? Like, here's a picture of it. You can see it right here. What's really interesting about it is it has this little adjustable dial. It looks really cool. It's kind of fun to fidget with. Like, it actually feels super nice. And then here's what's interesting. I know it looks like maybe some other products you've seen before, but this one is very, very interesting because it uses no electronics. It's completely natural. Instead of vapor, it uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses all natural, delicious flavors. And I'm sure you're thinking, like, what does that mean, flavored air? Like, I remember the first time I heard that, I was like, flavored air is not a real thing. And then I tried it, and I was like, oh, I get what they're saying. Yeah, this is very refreshing. My favorite flavor is the mint flavor. It just is a deep breath of fresh air. It makes you feel like calm. It's an anxiety reducer, and it's completely natural, completely safe. It is awesome. I really enjoy it. And it's a great way to replace a bad habit with just a regular habit that can reduce your anxiety and make you feel good. It's awesome. It looks cool when you're holding it. No one comes up to you. I've had people come up to me and be like, dude, that thing's awesome. Can I try it? And I'm like, yeah, dude, it's just flavored air. And they're like, what? So why does it make you feel so good? Because it is just a regular habit that doesn't give you any of the harmful chemicals that some of the other bad habits might give you. So if you're interested, this is what I think you should do. I want you to check out the Journey Pack, okay? You can go to tryfume.com, that's T-R-Y, fume, F-U-M.com, and use the code Gagnon. And when you use that code, you can get 10% off the Journey Pack. Now, the Journey Pack is awesome. It's got everything you need to get started. And I'm sure you're thinking, like, I don't know which one to get. Journey Pack, it's simple. Everything you need right in that little pack. It's going to help you replace some bad habits, and it's just going to make you feel better. It looks cool. It feels cool. It's just a nice little fixation. It gets you going. Anytime you're thinking, oh, I want to do the bad thing, just do the regular habit. It's awesome. So if you're interested, go to tryfume, T-R-Y, fume.com, and use the code Gagnon. Save 10% off when you get the Journey Pack. That is tryfume, tryfum.com. Use the code Gagnon to save an additional 10%. If you know me, you know I'm a natural person, borderline hippie. I know I look disgusting. I don't like putting stuff in my body that's bad for me. I don't like putting in stuff that's artificial. I try to stay away from all that, and that's why I try Fume. Let's get back to the show.
As we mentioned, like, there's 1 in 500 million, I think you had said, a chance that you could have like an adverse effect, right? Something like that. I mean, there have been some rare, very rare cases of measles, of almost measles-like encephalitis occurring in children vaccinated against measles.
And what should happen in those cases? Like, what should be like the recourse? Is there a way to test for that to see if a child will have an adverse effect to a vaccine?
I don't think in advance. I mean, there is this National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the NVIC, which is something anti-vaxxers do not really like, but it's probably the best that we can do. This was a program set up by Congress in the 1980s because vaccine makers were being sued out of existence.
Right.
Because vaccines, up until recently, with COVID, are really not some of the very profitable pharma products. And so a lot of companies were sort of saying, rather than all of these lawsuits, we are just going to stop making vaccines. It's not really worth it. So in order to not have measles and polio make comeback, and diphtheria, Congress set up this act, I think in the 1980s. And basically what it does is it pays out money to people who have been injured by vaccines. And it's heavily weighted in favor of the person making the claim.
Oh, really?
In other words, the standard of proof is 50%. I think it's like, I forget the legal term, but basically it's 50% plus a feather. That's number one. Number two, I think lawyers are paid for, so you don't necessarily have to hire lawyers. And it's most of the things that it pays out for are actually injection injuries, like people who've gotten a vaccine in their shoulder.
And they get like a bruise or a muscle spasm or something?
Well, not something minor like that, but something like it goes into the joint itself.
Oh, wow.
So, some very local.
That would be like an administrative error. I
Yes,
guess.
correct.
I see.
So injuries that way, things that actually don't get a lot of attention,
Right. Yeah.
And even beyond this, vaccine makers can be sued if they are found negligent in some way. So if there's a bad batch of vaccines, which I don't think that's happened in the United States, that's happened at least in a couple other countries. But they're not entirely immune from lawsuits.
Interesting. Okay, so this would be what people talk about when they bring up like the Hannah Poling case.
Yeah. So that was yes, I think she got paid for that. This was a girl who had a vaccine and had some sort of behavioral regression and was later found to have a mitochondrial disorder. In other words, something that she was born with. But there was a question of whether the vaccine sort of triggered that or set that off in some way. Either way, to this day, it sort of remains an N of one. I don't know of any other Hannah Paulings out there.
Right. Yeah, I guess that would be concerning to me. Like if I don't have kids, but if my kid was about to get vaccinated for whatever that vaccine, I don't forget which one they claimed caused the adverse effect. But thinking like, oh, does my kid have a mitochondrial disorder? But then I'm like, but do I want my kid to get measles or whatever the vaccine was? That is a difficult challenge for a parent to weigh, I guess. So how would you advise a parent that was dealing with that?
If they were worried if their child had a mitochondrial disorder?
Yeah, or like, I think there is a greater burden of pain for parents that take action than those that take no action. That the idea of, oh, if I get my child vaccinated, there's a 1 in however many million chance that they could have a mitochondrial disorder, develop encephalopathy from some vaccine, have an adverse effect, and then from that point forward have autism or autism-like symptoms. Or I could do nothing and risk them potentially getting measles and maybe getting over it, or there's a chance that they die. And I think parents, when they weigh that, the fear of action outweighs the fear of inaction.
Oh, that's true. Because when and this affects us as doctors as well, that we tend to feel worse about problems that we cause rather than ones that we fail to prevent.
Sure.
But I think if you look at it rationally, the numbers favor vaccination unquestionably. And not all parents might end up feeling that way. It would be interesting to talk to some of the parents whose children were hospitalized during the measles outbreaks, for example. Certainly, over the pandemic, stories of vaccine regret are quite common. People who regretted not getting the vaccine, including parents who regretted not getting the vaccine for their children, some of whom who died. So preventable deaths. And it's rare for a child to die of a vaccine preventable disease in the United States. Before COVID, around 300 children died per year annually of vaccine preventable diseases, the flu being the most common. And when I use the word vaccine preventable, it doesn't mean that the vaccine is 100% effective in every single case.
Right.
So when I speak about COVID as a vaccine preventable disease, I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying the vaccine is absolutely perfect, because no vaccine is, certainly not these COVID vaccines. But around 300 kids would die per year. And it's been years since certain children have died of of diseases like measles. I think the last time was 1990. That was the last fatal measles outbreak in the United States, when 8 kids or so died in Philadelphia. It's been, I don't think in my entire lifetime a child has not even died of polio, but contracted polio here in the United States. So certain of these diseases we are vaccinating not to protect my child against getting polio as much as to prevent polio from regaining a foothold here in the United States.
Right, and spreading through the whole population.
Right.
Yeah. And so even with like the measles outbreak that you mentioned in New York, I think it was within the Hasidic community in 2019, there weren't fatalities, just people were hospitalized.
Correct. I do not think anyone died. And this is a very common anti-vaccine technique, is to only focus on death as the bad outcome.
Right. If you look at that with polio, they're like, he didn't die.
Correct.
His legs don't work, but he didn't die.
Correct. And measles was a very common cause of encephalitis, of deafness. And, even children who spent 2 weeks in the ICU during our measles outbreak, they didn't die, thank God, but they suffered. So if I poured a caustic substance onto my child's body and gave him a burn and a rash and a fever, and then my child recovered, you'd think of me correctly as a monster, right? You'd report me, I'd hope, to Child Protective Services. You'd call 911 right away, but you do that with a virus. And again, I get the difference. I'm not saying anti-vaccine parents are like people who pour caustic chemicals on their children, but it does cause needless suffering, even if it doesn't kill children.
Right. So I guess I'm just trying to like find the what the explanation would be as far as, understanding that some medications will cause adverse effects. Some people take Tylenol and will have an adverse effect, and they can't take Tylenol. And some people can't take, this medication or whatever else. Like, all medications have side effects. Is that a fair statement to say in some populations?
Yeah, I can't think of any medication that is going to be completely and totally safe. I don't know, maybe some of the heartburn medications, but yeah.
Right. And I think that's like an important point to acknowledge, because I think that at least in my opinion, for studying some of like the academic position on vaccines, the anti-vaccine community is so rabid and so fervent one way, suggesting that if your kid gets vaccinated, they will have autism. It feels like the overcorrection is saying like vaccines are completely safe, which is also kind of not true. That I guess there are some people that will have adverse effects from some vaccines. And obviously not every person that gets vaccinated has autism, because we've all been vaccinated. So it's like, I think it's trying to cut out some of the fallaciousness from trying to overcorrect from the other side. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to draw like a false middle ground here, but understanding that, yeah, there are some people that will have adverse effects, and that is a part of it. But the purpose is to save 1 million people. And that there's an ethical conundrum that people are trying to solve here.
Well, it's a lot like seatbelts. There's a whole literature on seatbelt injuries. And if you Google seatbelt injury, you'll see some people with horrible, nasty cuts and slices in their chest from seatbelts, and those people would have gone through the windshield without the seatbelt. Right. So it's just a matter of which of these is putting the odds in your favor.
Yeah, I could imagine someone that gets in a car accident and gets ejected from the car because they don't have a seatbelt may have lived, but instead the car went into a lake and they couldn't get their seatbelt off and they died. So had they not had the seatbelt, they would have lived. Does that mean seatbelts are dangerous? No, they're objectively safer, but some people will have adverse effects from using seatbelts.
Yeah, and you're right that parents tend to feel guiltier about problems they solved rather than ones that they failed to prevent, because measles is seen as natural, which it is, and vaccine preventable diseases are seen as natural. And a lot of people have this Pollyannish view of nature, that nature can't be harmful, that nature is, look at how much natural is used in marketing.
Sure.
So natural immunity sounds attractive to people for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I think people definitely are drawn to natural. I forget where I was reading this, but there was a study that was done effectively looking at 2 different compounds. I forget where I read this, but 2 different compounds saying, would you rather ingest, this compound from an herb or the synthetic version that is identical, perfectly identical, but happens to be synthetic? Which one would you prefer? And overwhelmingly, myself included, I'm like, I'll take the herbal one, right? Like, why would I take the synthetic one? And it makes sense in my brain, but then when I think about it, I'm like, maybe there is a little bit of a bias that's happening that's drawn to naturalism. But I don't really know why. I mean, I feel better taking herbs than taking a synthetic version, even if they're the same thing. I'm curious what your thoughts as far as the bias towards naturalism.
Yeah, because let's see, there's a religion professor, Alan Leibovitz, who's written a whole book on this topic. I think that we just have this sense that the industrial world has harmed us in a lot of ways. And when we think of man-made chemicals, we think of factories belching smoke into the sky, causing all sorts of pollutants.
Right,
and
or like Roundup chemicals in our food. And
exactly right. And then we think of natural, we tend to think of walking through fields of flowers,
right.
And people living in bountiful times where all you had to do to eat every morning was just throw a net into the ocean, and 100 fish would jump into it, and then you could enjoy the rest of the day sitting around the fire, cooking hanging out with your buddies in your tribe. So there's this very mythical sort of view of natural things as being safe.
Yeah, I guess you could say that cholera is natural.
Oh, there's 101 bazillion things that are natural that are very dangerous to us. Cobra venom is natural. Black widow venom is natural. Bears are natural, So there's a lot of things in nature that really don't have our best interest in mind.
Now, as far as natural immunity is concerned, what, I guess for you personally, or like what you would tell patients or people that ask you, what amount of pressure should I apply on my natural immune system? Like if there's a flu going around and I can't really get the flu shot, is it okay to rely on my natural immune system to try to fight it? Will exercise and vitamin D and a good diet, is it worth doing those things to boost my natural immune system? And how do you sort of cut those conflicting ideas?
So I don't really know that there's any way to necessarily boost your immune system, and it's not really clear that you would want to. A lot of diseases in medicine are autoimmune diseases and are triggered by an overactive immune system. So there's a price to be paid for excessive immunity as well. Getting back to multiple sclerosis, for example, most of the medicines that I give are actually work on the immune system to suppress it or to tamper it down in some sort of way.
Interesting.
Don't get me wrong about eating healthy and exercising.
Of course.
There's like 6 or 7 things that you can do to really, really, really put the odds of living a long life, to put them in your favor, and exercise and healthy eating
certainly up there.
Yeah, and they will greatly increase your chance of doing well if you get a disease like COVID. We all know that it tends to prey on people with underlying medical conditions, and not that everyone can control them. It's not that every single person who is overweight doesn't exercise and doesn't eat well. That's not true. But to the extent that you have control over those things, yes, you should exercise, you should eat right. These are almost placed as if they're in competition with vaccines, that if you get a vaccine, you are telling someone you don't have to do those sorts of things, which is nonsense.
So as far as the sociology of like the anti-vaccine movement is concerned, do you have you ever dealt with parents whose kids specifically may have had like an adverse reaction, either chronic pain or just like temporary adverse reaction to a vaccine? And do you empathize with what they're going through? And then vice versa, have you dealt with parents whose children have died of measles, who you empathize what they have gone through?
Yeah, so I'm not a pediatrician. So the youngest that I treat is age 18. And as I said, fortunately, a child dying of a vaccine preventable disease in the United States is an extraordinarily rare thing. And this is even true with COVID. And it's just a vanishingly rare thing. So most pediatricians will go their entire career and not see a child die of a vaccine preventable disease. But I've seen many of my patients have refused the COVID vaccine. And of course, I empathize with them. I mean, these people are being bombarded by all sorts of bad information, of misinformation. I view them as victims, and some of my patients died of COVID after a vaccine was available. There was a man who I'd known for many years. He had MS, and I tried to talk him into getting the COVID vaccine, and no, that's it. That shut down nope, not getting it. And he was dead a month later. His wife called me and let me know. So yeah, I empathize with them. In terms of people who have had side effects of vaccines, it's always a little bit hard to tell because people tend to blame everything bad that happens after getting a vaccine on the vaccine. So for example, when the pediatric, I got my start writing this pandemic right before the pediatric COVID vaccines were authorized for children. They were authorized in May 2021, and that was when I wrote my first article on the blog Science-Based Medicine for writing about the pediatric COVID vaccine. And one thing that I wrote in that article, one of the predictions I made, which was a very easy prediction to make and came true, is that once you give a vaccine to tens of millions of American children, something bad is going to happen to some of them within the next couple of weeks. If I took 30,000 American children who've gotten the COVID vaccine, or 30,000 American children, and I gave them a glass of water, some would be dead in a week or two, totally unexpectedly. And I correctly predicted that the vaccine would be to blame for that. And we have to remain open that possibly the vaccine was, but I think that is very unlikely in the case of the COVID vaccines, certainly for children.
And so do you believe, as far as when people say vaccine is safe and effective, that it is safe as far as for children?
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the COVID vaccine for children, if that's okay.
And is the COVID vaccine different than other vaccines that we've talked about?
It's a new technology. They're both new ones and they're both old ones. So they're viral vector vaccines. That's what I got in my original trial, the AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm one of the few Americans. That's more of an Irish accent anyways, but it's a British vaccine.
That's pretty good. I think you got that, dude.
Well, British accent needs a little bit.
Is that a side effect of the vaccine?
It makes me talk a little British.
You get a vaccine?
But I get into I go from British to Irish. Anyways, doesn't matter. Okay, and then there was the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a traditional, meaning what they did is they took the spike protein and they engineered that into a vaccine, and they injected the spike protein so that your body mounted an immune response. Now, the virus has mutated so much that those original vaccines are not so much use. And then there's the new technology, the mRNA vaccines, which is probably what 90% of people here got, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And what that does, so mRNA is basically a code for your body to make proteins. And so they gave the code for the spike protein, and then your body made that protein, and then your immune system mounted an immune response, and it was all gone within a few days.
That's interesting. So it's able to signal to your body to make the antigen.
Correct.
Interesting. And how is the antigen already present in your body for it to respond to?
Well, it wasn't. So it made the mRNA got taken up into cells, which made the protein.
Interesting.
So the mRNA is really just a code, essentially.
Right. Interesting. And why is that better than using a live antigen, or not even a live, but a traditional?
I don't know that it was better necessarily, other than the fact that it could be created very quickly and created at scale very rapidly, and the technology could be adjusted very quickly.
Interesting. Okay,
but I don't know that it necessarily, especially back when these vaccines were first coming out at the very end of 2020, I don't know necessarily that it was better than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, for example.
I see. If retroactively, is there any confirmation or data to support that one was better than the other?
The virus, things have changed so much. We have a totally different virus now. Again, the original mRNA vaccines or the original Johnson & Johnson vaccines are probably of close to no use against the variant that's circulating. And that's been one of the challenges over the course of the pandemic, is that everything we knew about the virus 3 years ago is no longer true today, because the virus has changed so much and we've changed so much. The population has changed so much. Tragically, pretty much all the vulnerable people, the people who are going to die of COVID, have already died of COVID. I mean, it's not to say there aren't hundreds of people dying daily. We obviously don't have scenes of mass death in our hospitals like we did 3 years ago at this time. But COVID has already found and picked off our most vulnerable. I mean, it sounds like such a horrible, heartless thing to say, but it's kind of true. And whereas none of us had immunity to COVID 3 years ago, there's probably not a single person around who doesn't have some form of immunity, either from the vaccine, the virus, or both.
Interesting.
So the virus is completely and totally changed, and so have we, which is another problem with randomized controlled trials over the course of the pandemic, is most of these trials take years to do. So a randomized controlled trial that was started in 2020 would have no relevance to today. Right.
Interesting.
Think about the original mRNA vaccine trials, the ones that came out at the very end of 2020. I don't know if you remember that. I remember reading the newspaper, the giant headline, vaccine found to be 95% effective at preventing COVID infections. So these original vaccine trials were extraordinarily positive. But if I was to cite those trials today,
What are we even talking
They're
about?
historical relics
Yeah.
at this point. So
Interesting.
that's another problem with randomized controlled trials, at least in the middle of a pandemic.
Right. Yeah, I heard people say that. I think RFK maybe mentioned it, but that there's no placebo group for the COVID vaccine.
So this has been one of the complaints with some of the boosters, is that they haven't done randomized. So the original vaccine trials, there absolutely was a placebo group.
Right. That was the one that you were in.
Correct. But with some of the boosters, there hasn't been. And there's some precedent for this. Every single flu vaccine every year is not subjected to a randomized controlled trial. Some of the alterations that they are making to the current vaccines in order to make them match the circulating strains a little bit better they're tweaking it, so it's kind of like a car manufacturer. I don't know, do they have to do a separate road test if they alter the tire tracks a tiny little bit? I don't know. You get
Right.
my
Yeah.
point. Do they have to start from scratch? I mean, there's some people who suggest that for every single molecule that you change on these vaccines, you should start from the beginning and do a randomized.
To be 100% scientifically pure, that would be ideal.
But not even, because by the time that those trials were done, a new variant would render them obsolete.
Interesting.
So we all the time in medicine have to make decisions based on incomplete information. As a neurologist, I treat rare diseases all the time for which there aren't these giant randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials to guide my every single decision. And the whole world is getting a taste of that when it comes to these booster vaccines.
Yeah.
But there's a precedence for this in virology and vaccinology, is that vaccines, once they have been shown to induce an immune response, it's not a huge leap to imagine that they're going to protect you against the virus. And again, there's precedence for this. The HPV vaccines, for example, were not licensed on their ability to prevent cancer. Why is that? Because HPV-related cancers can take decades after the initial infection to develop. So they were licensed on their ability to create an immune response and to stop cancer precursors, something called CIN, which I think that stands for cervical invasive neoplasia, something like that. Anyways, it's a precancerous lesion.
Gotcha. But it takes decades in order to test that.
Correct. So it was licensed based on its ability to stop HPV infection and these precancerous lesions. Had we done a 20-year-long randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, sure, you could have probably shown that it would have prevented cervical cancers, but there would have been a big price to pay. And we now have data from massive observational trials of millions of women that rates of cervical cancer are plummeting with countries that have high HPV vaccination rates. So in other words, my point is we used this vaccine before there was pristine evidence that it would prevent cervical cancer, and it was a good thing that we did. And the same is going on with boosters right now, is we're using these vaccines sometimes before we have pristine evidence that they're going to be effective. But you have to make decisions in the real world.
Yeah.
And leaving people vulnerable to a virus is a decision.
Yeah. I think that's an important note, that these people that are in these decisions to sort of like administer or approve or not approve of vaccines are in a really difficult ethical position, because they either, they're working with incomplete or fully pristine data, as you say. So they can either go forward with that data and they just hope that it is effective and not adversarial to whoever's being inoculated, or that they could maybe save a lot of people. And they have to really balance these, or I guess rather that they could potentially, that it's ineffective. I guess they just have to really weigh these things, and that there's a real world ethical decision happening every single time there's a virus or some type of outbreak, or with any even new vaccine that comes out. People are in rooms really deliberating. I think it's important to dispel the idea that it's like an evil group of doctors trying to hurt people.
And all of this is publicly available. So when people say we need to debate and we need to discuss vaccines, you can look up meetings of the American Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, and all of their vaccine debates where they go over the data. This is all online. I do want to talk a little bit more about pediatric COVID, because that's probably what in the pediatric COVID vaccine, because that's probably what I've written about more than any other topic.
Right.
And I think no myth has become more entrenched this pandemic than that COVID is harmless for kids. And I think that's unfortunate.
Right. Yeah. That is the rhetoric I feel like I kind of picked up throughout the pandemic, is like, okay, there's this illness. It affects old people. It affects overweight people. and that's basically it. If you have some type of like lung or cardiac issue, it affects you. But young people generally are okay. If you get it, you'll be sick for 3 days and you'll be fine. That is the way that I kind of understood this.
And that's not entirely wrong. That's true for the vast majority of young, healthy people. But when you look at rare events multiplied by hundreds of millions of young, healthy people begin to add up.
Right.
And thus far, I'm talking just about people under the age of 18, somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 children have died of COVID. The exact number isn't entirely clear. There's ways that it could be potentially overcounted. There's also ways that it could be undercounted as well. There are a lot of deaths that are just coded as pneumonia, for example, not necessarily due to COVID. And that's definitely comparable to other vaccine-preventable diseases, such as chickenpox, even measles, before vaccines were available. And as we just got done saying, death is not the only bad outcome. So hundreds of thousands of children have been hospitalized this pandemic. Most do fine, but some have been very sick. Some have needed to be intubated in the ICU. Occasionally, children have had strokes or seizures or encephalitis and needed amputations or lung transplants. These are rare but catastrophic events that are not fatal. And the vaccine for children was studied in about 25,000 children in 6 separate randomized controlled trials. Each one of these trials was relatively small. So why were there 6? Because it was one by Moderna, one by Pfizer, for 3 age groups, for adolescents, for elementary school children, and then for babies and toddlers. So and about 25,000 children were studied in vaccine RCTs, which is not a small number. Now, kind of like the adult vaccine RCTs, the original pediatric vaccine trials are now kind of historical relics, but we have data from close to 25 to 30 trials, observational studies, once the vaccine has been unleashed in the real world, not just from the CDC, but also from other countries, showing that the vaccine does an exceptional job at preventing very rare but grave outcomes in children. It's not perfect. Vaccinated children still have died of COVID, but it really takes a risk that is already low, probably 1 in 20,000. And same with adults. Children with underlying conditions have a much greater risk.
Right.
You know, the risk of a healthy child dying of COVID is vanishingly low, but again, not zero.
Right.
And it takes a very low risk and it drops it to as close to zero as you can get.
Right. And what were the findings from those studies?
So the vaccine RCTs, again, it sort of paralleled the adult studies. So the original, the adolescent vaccine randomized controlled trials were done right after the adult vaccine trials. So the adult vaccine trials were announced at the end of 2020, and the adolescent vaccine trial was announced in March 2021, a year after the pandemic, and it found the vaccine to be 100% effective at stopping COVID in adolescents. So there were 16 COVID cases in the placebo group and 0 in the control group. Again, these are historical relics at this point. By the time the trial got around to younger children, babies and toddlers, unfortunately, new variants had emerged which had escaped our vaccines. So the vaccine was less effective in that group. And it was largely based on its ability to mount an antibody response rather than did it stop COVID? Exactly.
Right. Because this, again, is going to your point of like requiring time. You're looking at, is it triggering an immune response? And we can look at that in the short term.
Correct.
As far as, quote unquote, stopping COVID, whatever that means, that would have to be looked at for a longer period of time.
Right. And one of the objections to these vaccine trials, actually both for children and adults, is that it didn't show that it prevented death, because deaths from COVID were very rare,
right,
in these trials of mostly young, healthy people. And this is one of the problems with vaccine RCTs. Even though they are held up to be the gold standard, generally speaking, they're not representative of the general population, because who enrolled in vaccine trials? Generally, it was people like myself who are healthy enough to get back and forth to the trial site, who are, have the resources to learn about the trial to begin with. 90-year-old nursing home residents aren't going to enroll in these trials, even though they're the ones who are going to benefit the most from the vaccine. So that's one of the many ways ways that randomized controlled trials are not always the gold standard.
This would be like a volunteer bias.
Correct.
That because people that might be interested in this might also, listen to like medical media, and people who listen to medical media might have better nutrition and they might eat better. And so they might have better immune systems, et cetera. So as a result of this volunteer bias, the people that are volunteering may be predisposed to performing better in these things rather than someone that, might be overweight that doesn't know about these trials living in a different part of the country.
Exactly right. So the population that enrolls in a randomized clinical trial is not always going to be representative of the general population.
Right. Which I guess makes a real challenge for vaccine researchers because, how can you really be, it's not up to that pristine standard of scientific credibility that you had mentioned.
Well, it's as good as you can get.
Yeah.
And certain,
it's challenging.
Certain groups have historically been not allowed to enroll in vaccine trials. So pregnant women are generally excluded. People with significant underlying medical conditions, people with HIV, or people who are on immunosuppressive therapies. Certain populations like prisoners, for example, aren't enrolled in randomized trials. So with every study design, you lose something and you gain something. Different studies are used to answer different types of medical questions.
Right.
Again, in a world with unlimited time, unlimited money, and zero ethics, we would study everything
perfectly
via randomized controlled trial. If we could force people at gunpoint to sign up for trials, sure.
Right. Now, were there any adverse effects within children from any of the COVID vaccines that you saw?
So not in the randomized controlled trials. Once the vaccine had been unleashed on millions of children, some side effects began to emerge, the main one being myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. This is a condition that affects primarily males between the ages of 12 to 30, for example, usually after their second vaccine dose. And when talking about this, I think there's really, I suppose, three things that we have to consider. Number one, how often does it happen? And data from around the world has been a little conflicting, but there was a recent study of studies called a meta-analysis, which sort of aggregates all of the studies together. And it came up with a rate of about 1 in 15,000 after the second vaccine dose for teenage boys, adolescent boys aged 12 to 17. So that's about how often it happens. And if you do the math and you look at how many teenage boys receive 2 vaccine doses, that's probably around 800 American boys who have suffered this condition. Okay. And then you want to know how severe is it, right? Myocarditis doesn't sound good.
Sounds bad.
Inflammation of the heart doesn't
like
sound bad. Yeah. And then first of all, other vaccines can cause this too. This is not unique necessarily to the COVID vaccine. So if you look at the severity of it, every single study reports that it has a favorable prognosis. And some people on Twitter have gotten mad at me. They feel that I'm minimizing this. Oh, you're calling it favorable heart inflammation. So maybe this is some medical speak. But what it's saying is that children with this condition, fortunately, tend to do very well. In the most recent study out of Canada, once we have learned how to manage this condition, I should say I don't treat the heart. Most children with it were sent home from the emergency room. They were not even admitted. The number of children who were admitted, they all went home after a day, and they were treated with just ibuprofen, for example. In terms of catastrophic outcomes in the entire world, I have read of one child from Japan who plausibly died from the COVID vaccine, a 14-year-old girl who got her COVID vaccines and had overwhelming myocarditis and died 3 or 4 days later. That's the one child I've seen die. There was a study out of South Korea, where there were 2 children out of 2 million who had fulminant myocarditis, meaning pretty catastrophic, but according to the paper, they both recovered from that as well. And these children will have to be monitored over the long term to make sure that there's no cardiac scarring. So I don't want to minimize this.
Right.
A vaccine took previously healthy children. It made them have chest pain and shortness of breath. And
it's unfortunate.
It's very unfortunate. And they were hospitalized. They felt unwell. Their parents were scared. Some of them were asked to refrain from vigorous activity for 3 to 6 months. If you're an athlete, that's not cool.
Yeah.
But then you have to compare this to what the virus has done. And it's just not even close. So during the peak of the Omicron wave, for example, there were about 900 children being admitted to hospitals per day in January 2022, which equals the number of children who have gotten vaccine myocarditis in total. And I should say this, vaccine myocarditis does not occur in children under age 12 or 11, but the same people who are very, very, very worried about vaccine myocarditis in teenagers have found other reasons to oppose the vaccine in children, elementary school children and babies and toddlers, showing that really what they're motivated against is being anti-vaccine. And the virus has done much more harm to children's hearts. Around 10,000 children have developed this condition, multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, which is this poorly understood condition that occurs primarily in healthy elementary school children. A few weeks after a COVID infection, they almost get this severe, overwhelming autoimmune type condition, which affects multiple organs, sends 80% of children to the ICU, and has killed about 80 children. Fortunately, seems to be largely a thing of the past at this point. It doesn't seem to be prevalent as common with the latest variants, thank goodness. Or maybe every child who's already gotten it has already gotten it, and it's not as common with second and third infections as well. But that commonly causes myocarditis and has caused hemodynamic collapse in children. So some people have accused me of minimizing vaccine myocarditis, but then all of these people will go will minimize death. And I mean this very literally, that there are a lot of anti-vaccine advocates, and including anti-vaccine doctors, who will speak about death from COVID in children as vanishingly rare, 1 in 20,000, and they're right about that. But then we'll speak about an equally rare side effect as this catastrophic thing. How dare you minimize this? And it shouldn't be controversial that a mild temporary vaccine side effect is not as bad as death. But that's become very controversial these days.
Yeah, I understand I kind of understand both sides, where it's like, if you are someone who had a healthy child and then now they have myocarditis, or vaccine-induced myocarditis, either severely or benignly, it would be frustrating, I guess, that someone's like, well, you have to look at the greater picture and look at the amount of deaths that are happening from COVID, the amount of heart problems that are coming from COVID. But I would say it sounds sort of similar, I guess, when anti-vaxxers will be like, oh, but measles, measles isn't so bad. If you get measles, very few people die, and most of them are fine. Or polio, people will bring this up, where they're like, with polio, 0.001 are dying, and most kids are fine. And, if you get it, you pass it, relatively fine. What would you say is the difference when it comes to people that are coming up with that argument to say, people that are getting vaccine or vaccine-related illness is not as big of a problem in the greater picture, and then anti-vaxxers will say, oh, but if you get an illness, the illness is, or I guess most people are fine when they contract an illness versus the other side.
So I think that it goes back to what we've been talking about this whole time, is that things that are natural are seen as less harmful than things that are intentional, right? It's the example of, let's say, for example, after our conversation today, you looked in your wallet, your pocket, and there was a $20 bill that wasn't there, all right? And then, there's footage of it, and it just fell out of your pocket, right? And someone found it on the street. Now, you'd be mildly annoyed, whatever, not a big deal, right? Let's say you found out I pickpocketed you, right? You'd be livid, right? With that asshole Howard.
Yeah. He comes into my tent and steals my money, dude. I gotta buy another poster. Right. Steal my $20.
So I think that's what it has to do, is that the vaccine is the version of being pickpocketed, right? That someone did this to you, that it was a pharmaceutical company.
Yeah.
They told you it was safe. The doctors told you it was safe. And now your kid is in the hospital with myocarditis, right?
Yeah, I get the frustration. It's a little bit of a trolley problem.
It's very much a trolley problem. That was one of my articles on science-based medicine, right?
Right.
It's definitely a trolley problem. And it's just that people, again, they feel worse about problems that they cause rather than ones they fail to prevent, especially when what you fail to prevent is seen as is from a naturally occurring source.
Can you speak to what your thoughts as far as how the trolley problem relates to this? And would you mind just explaining kind of what that is and kind of what you discussed in the article?
So I think everyone knows what the trolley problem is pretty much, but it was this thought experiment where people are tied to train tracks. On one of the train tracks, 5 people are tied down, and on one of the other train tracks, 1 person is tied down, and the trolley is going to kill 5 people unless you pull a lever, in which case the trolley will be diverted and it will kill just 1 person. Do you pull the lever?
That's tough.
Most people pull the lever, at least in experiments, thought experiments, not real ones, because we have the sense that it's better for one person to die than for 5 people to die. But there are versions of this problem where people act very differently. Have you heard of it's called the fat man version of this?
Explain this. This is fun.
Yeah, so it's basically someone. So it's the exact same scenario. There's 5 people tied to a trolley, and you're standing on tied to a train track, and they're going to be run over. And you're standing on a bridge, and there's a very large person, and you can push that person onto the train tracks. He will die, but he will stop the train. Do you push that person? And it has to do with and most people sort of resist that because that man is seen sort of like he's not really in this game. He's just happened to be walking by, kind of like me, and it's seen as a more active sort of thing.
Even though the outcome's the same.
And we don't do this, for example. It's funny, before we turned on the microphones, we were talking about my father's profession. He was a transplant surgeon, right?
In Gainesville. Respect, shout out to Florida.
Go Gators.
Let's go.
We could harvest your organs and save 5 or 6 lives. 2 kidneys, a heart, couple lungs, liver. Pretty healthy guy, right? But we don't do that. Mm-hmm. Some countries might, but that's a different story.
I don't want to go to those countries. I'll stay in this country.
Some countries, I've heard some bad things. But anyways, so we don't do that, right? Because we sort of recognize that, yes, even though we could kill you and save 6 lives, you have independent worth. Anyways, we're getting a little bit off topic, but the vaccine, it's a little version of the trolley problem, right? Mm-hmm. Are we willing to give 1 out of 15,000 children vaccine myocarditis, knowing that in the aggregate, it will prevent much more harm. Mm-hmm. And are we? Well, I don't know. Vaccine rates for children are extremely low. I think the anti-vaxxers, when it comes to children, won the pandemic. And as I said before, this is especially unfortunate because vaccine myocarditis does not occur in the youngest children. And it's the youngest children, babies in particular, who have by far and away the highest risk of COVID. So when we talk about young people and children not being vulnerable to COVID, that is not as true of babies. Mm-hmm. They are as vulnerable as older adults, to be honest with you.
It might be important to mention that myocarditis is one of the things that could happen, or one of the adverse effects that could happen. I know you'd mentioned that there were a few others. Obviously, I think they're more rare. But if you had compounded those with myocarditis, does that change sort of the calculation that we're looking at? Does that make sense?
Well, so what are the other side effects of the COVID vaccines aside from myocarditis?
Is it like lung stuff? I feel like there's...
No. So, I mean, there's the usual. There's the fever and sore arm, the sort of mild stuff.
It's not a chronic issue.
The most serious one is with what we talked about before, the Johnson & Johnson, the viral vector vaccines. Those have led to some very serious, and those have led to some fatal clotting issues, primarily in young women.
That's right.
And those vaccines were not even trialed in children once the side effect was discovered. So the vaccine trials for children were organized in a very thoughtful way. So the first vaccines were approved, I think, for everyone 16 and older. And after that, the vaccines were approved for children ages 12 to 15. After that, 5 to 11, and after that, 6 months to 5 years. And a lot of parents feel that we took too much time debating these trials, debating these vaccines and studying them. So there was a real cost to waiting. I want to get that point across because children, a lot of the youngest children were left totally helpless to the Delta wave and then to the Omicron wave. And tens of millions of American children were infected before they could have been vaccinated. And most did fine. I'm not here to catastrophize that. My kids all got COVID. My nieces and nephews did. And some of them were vaccinated. Some of them weren't. I didn't lose a moment's sleep over it. I thought they would be fine, and they turned out to be. But like I said, rare events multiplied by 73 million American children added up to a significant number of dead children, I think.
Yeah.
And suffering children. And, we haven't even talked about long COVID. And I think we have to be a little bit humble about the potential consequences of multiple infections. So a newborn who's born today, how many times will they get COVID by the time that you're your age?
Yeah, who knows?
Who knows? And who knows what the effects are going to be?
Right.
Hopefully not much, but we got to be humble that 10 COVID infections in 20 years might lead to some problems. There's some evidence that it increases the rates of diabetes. Children who have had COVID have a higher rate of seizures. So it's not really clear that it's going to turn out to be entirely benign.
What's up, guys? We got to take a break really quick because I have to tell you about the best vases in the game. Now, these vases are beautiful. Now, you can see a picture of them right here. I love these vases. I got this vase from my mother. I got this vase from my grandmother. My grandmother loves this vase. And you can use them for a lot of different things. I like to use it as a vase, and YouTube's monetization team likes to use it as a vase. So that's what I prefer to use it for. You can use it for really anything else you want or whatever your imagination can come up with. But I would prefer these vases compared to other vases, and here's why. Sometimes with a regular vase, you're going to put a flower into it, and you're going to smell the flower, and all of a sudden, all the hot air from the day just sitting around your room, it's just stagnant air, is going to get into your lungs. It's going to get into your throat. You're going to start coughing. You're going to feel terrible. You're trying to smell the flower to relax and just chill and stop and smell the roses. But when you do it with a regular vase, it can hurt and do the exact opposite of what you're trying to do. So that's why I always tell people, check out thefreezepipe.com, because these vases have a glycerin chamber. And now here's what's cool. You put the glycerin chamber in the freezer for an hour, and it'll lower the temperature of the air in the vase by 300 degrees. That's crazy. So now imagine hot air that you're breathing in. Oh, that feels terrible. Or you could breathe in the calmest, smoothest, coldest air you could imagine. So now you're getting all of the relaxation benefits that you were looking for in the first place, if you want to smell flowers or flower with this vase. It's awesome. I got it from my friends in college. Everyone I know uses these vases with the glycerin chamber. So if you're interested and trying to stop smelling hot air every time you take a deep breath of flower, you can go to thefreezepipe.com and use the code Gagnon to get 10% off your entire order. That's correct. Thefreezepipe.com. Use the code Gagnon, Gagnon, for 10% off your entire order. You don't have to spend all this money, an arm and a leg, just to stop smelling hot flower smoke, all right? Get it for your mom for Mother's Day. Get it for your grandma for Grandmother's Day. I don't even know if that's a holiday, but make it one, all right? Now let's get back to the show. Hey guys, we're going to take a break really quick because I have to tell you about the greatest set in podcast history. And that's the set we're sitting in right now. Yeah. I'm sure you're wondering, Mark, that tent, there must have been a custom-made tent. That must have been a tent that you must have fabricated yourself, that you forged in the wood with papyrus reeds. And I'm here to tell you that's not the case. I actually got this tent from the good people at White Duck Outdoors. Yeah. It is an amazing tent. And everyone that comes in here is like, dude, this is the coziest, comfiest tent I've ever been in my entire life. And you can use it as a tent. You can use it as a podcast studio, whatever you want to use it for. But I'm telling you, if you're going to get a tent, you got to go with White Duck Outdoors. Okay. Right now we are sitting in the Alpha Wall tent. That's correct. Everyone that I've had come through here, Paul Rodriguez, people that have been abducted by aliens, they all go, man, if I was in this tent, my life would have been different. I'm just saying what they said, okay? So this is the Alpha Wall tent. If you're curious, if you're trying to go camping, you're trying to spend a long time outdoors, even if you just want to set up like a little Airbnb on your property, let's say you have a big backyard, the kids want to go sleep out there, you want to go sleep out, you know, get some fresh air, get some Mother Nature going in your lungs, you can get the Alpha Wall tent, set it up. There's a million uses for these tents. They're extremely durable. And here's what I love about White Duck Outdoors. They are outdoor people, truly. They love the outdoors. They're not in this to make a quick buck. They truly are outdoor people that use these products, and they're making the products that they would use. A lot of these other companies, none of these people go camping. None of these people go outside. They just make stuff that looks cool, that they can just flip easy, but it's made really cheaply. Not White Duck Outdoors. This stuff is supreme. It is premium, and that's because the people that make it actually use it. So if you're interested, you can go to whiteduckoutdoors.com. Check out their whole selection. They have a bunch of different types of tents. They got bigger tents than this. They have massive ones. They have ones that you can use for a bunch of different settings. If you want to go really low temperatures, if you want to do something a little bit breezier, there's a lot of different options. They even just have like other gear. They got, you know, apparel, they have t-shirts, they have bags, they have everything you need for going into the great outdoors. So stop wasting time. If you're going to go camping, you got to check out whiteduckoutdoors.com. Now let's get back to the show.
I think that it is an important point to highlight that it is sort of that trolley problem you mentioned as far as pediatric COVID vaccination is concerned. And I think that most people kind of understand that and accept that. However, I think a lot of anti-vaxxers probably get annoyed with the compulsory aspect. And I guess like the lack of personal freedom when it comes to I should be allowed to choose to not vaccinate my children, and I should be allowed to not engage with this, quote, trolley problem. And that if the government is forcing me to, or if there's sort of like infrastructure within society that's forcing me to, school, travel, et cetera, that it's unethical, both on like a personal autonomy basis, but also on like a constitutional basis. Again, I don't know about constitutional law, so I don't know how that would work, but I'm curious what your opinion is as far as compulsory vaccination for children, but then also for adults for themselves.
Yeah. I'll just correct one thing that you said is that you think that most people are willing to vaccinate their children. I mean, vaccination rates for our youngest children are abysmally low. So I do think that the anti-vaccine movement won the pandemic when it comes to vaccinating children and young adults.
Sorry, I just have a quick question on that. Do you feel like every person that has chosen not to vaccinate their children falls under an anti-vaccine umbrella?
Oh, no, absolutely not. And the word anti-vaccine can be used seen as kind of a slur, right?
Yeah, I think it's like a pejorative.
Right. So I want to be careful, not to do that. I think probably there's just we didn't do a good job of explaining the importance of it, and the idea got out there that COVID is entirely benign for children. So I think there was just not much of a motivation for people to vaccinate their kids.
Yeah,
as
of
much
course.
As
There's 2 years of, your kids are probably fine. And then all of a sudden you're trying to get them to take a medication.
Correct.
I'm like, why would I do this?
And let me just back up a little bit too. I just want to make one more point is that all of the numbers that I was talking about 2,000 children dead, and there are people who might quibble with me. They'll say, oh, some of these children died with COVID, not of COVID. Who knows? Maybe they're right. But what would have happened had we done what some people suggested and let COVID rip through 70 million unvaccinated kids at the start of the pandemic?
This is the Sweden example.
Basically. And a lot of doctors were proposing this early in the pandemic, that we should let children get infected to create herd immunity, for example.
Lock up the nursing homes, let kids get it, and
Exactly
that's the
right.
strategy.
And if that was the case, they want to pretend that things would have been just fine and dandy, but that would not have been the case. All of these numbers would have been much higher. The fact that we did successfully vaccinate millions of children prevented a lot of suffering, and pediatric hospitals, they did eventually get overwhelmed at times, not quite as bad, I think, as some of the adult hospitals, but they would have been overwhelmed. So when we talk about, only 1 in 20,000 children dies of COVID, whatever it is, that number would have been, that's not an absolute number. That number would have been higher had hospitals not been available to care for patients and had none of the children been vaccinated at the time. So it's important to think about what the counterfactuals would have been too.
Right.
And they would have spread it to their parents, and they would have spread it to their teachers. Here in New York City, we lost 74 educators the first month of the pandemic. So I forgot, what were you asking me about?
As far as like voluntary agency.
Oh, yeah. So I'm conflicted on this. First of all, no one was strapped down and forced against their will to get a vaccine.
Yeah, I think it's important to note.
Some people had to make some tough decisions. At my hospital, you could either get the vaccine or you could opt for, I think, weekly testing, something along those lines. And some people decided to quit. I think that there is a certain type of person who is just kind of oppositional, and if you say to them, the vaccine is mandated, I'm not getting it.
Yeah.
And if you had said to them, you're not allowed to work here if you get a vaccine, well, damn it, I'm gonna get the vaccine then.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of it to that.
Yeah, we had mentioned before, you got to treat the vaccine like sneakers. Like there's a whole sneaker culture where there's a limited drop. There's only 100.
Yes, yeah.
And so if you were like,
yeah.
hey, there's only 100 vaccines, people will be lining up, being like, well, come on, let me get it.
Well, for a limited time only, or supplies limited. That's
Sure.
that's the oldest marketing trick. in the
Scarcity
book.
will certainly drive
right.
desire.
Exactly right. So, and I think it depends a little bit on the vaccine. So I think the strength to mandate measles vaccines is stronger than the case to mandate COVID vaccines. COVID vaccines are our current ones. They're not useless when it comes to transmission, stopping transmission, but they're not the best either. But I'm a little conflicted because on the one hand, sure, I believe in personal autonomy and body autonomy. It depends if we're talking about kids versus adults, by the way.
We could do kids.
Okay, so with kids, it's a little different because kids are not property. Parents do not own their children. I cannot sell my child. I cannot starve my child. I cannot beat my child. And children have died from vaccine preventable diseases because their parents refused to vaccinate them. I alluded to this before. When was the last time that children were strapped down and vaccinated against their will? I don't expect you to know this. I'm not
Spanish flu?
No. I'm not. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but this was the last time that measles killed children in Philadelphia in 1990 and 1991. There was a church there that was anti-vaccine, and the public health commissioner went to a judge after 8 children had died, and he ordered 8 more children vaccinated against their parents' will. So there is precedent for this, and there was a Supreme Court case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, I think, in 1905, which upheld public vaccination laws. Again, when was the last time an adult was forcibly vaccinated against it? Probably never.
Right.
And it probably wouldn't be a good idea because anti-vaccine advocates love to portray themselves as victims. This is some of the most appalling things that have happened this pandemic. And even before the pandemic, they would wear yellow stars, Jewish stars, to symbolize their perceived persecution.
Yeah.
RFK Jr. has said some appalling things about even Anne Frank could hide away.
This is an over dramatization of what's going on. This is completely unfounded.
A little bit, there's, being sent to a concentration camp and gassed is probably not quite the same as being told you have to take a COVID test once a week or get the vaccine in order to work here.
Yeah, it's absurd.
And even if one feels that vaccine mandates were inappropriate. There are some doctors and members of my profession who've devoted great effort to fighting these mandates. And I think it's just showing where their priority is. Here we have hundreds of people dying, potentially preventable deaths. And your goal is to save a college student a vaccine that they may not need. It just seems misplaced kind of priorities. As the Titanic is sinking, you're worried about, whether you cut yourself shaving, for example. That's how it seems to me, and it's just taken on this sort of life of its own. But nothing upsets anti-vaccine advocates more than mandates. I've never come down for or against them. There are some modeling studies that show that they probably have saved thousands of lives.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, if let's say the numbers are, for every child that's vaccinated, 1 in 10 million, 100 million, 500 million will have a severe myocarditis, vaccine-induced myocarditis, or death even, maybe to an even greater extent, like the one case you mentioned in Japan. And then let's say if we do vaccinate all of them, this many kids will live. Like this one will die and this, hundreds of thousands will live. Like, let's just say that's the math, hypothetically, who knows? That is a trolley problem. You kind of have to do the trolley problem. And it makes sense. Most people, if they had to pull the lever, they'd probably be like, yeah, let's save a bunch of people. And unfortunately, one random person will die. And that is awful, but that's sort of what's happening in an emergency crisis. So I get that is sort of the calculation. And then when it comes to mandating it, I guess that's when they would say, no, you can't. So I understand, of course, if it's mandated, it probably would save more lives. But that comes into like the ethical situation and that's why I guess this is such an intersectional issue, is that you have the medicine, which is saying, if everyone gets this, more people will live, some people will die, that's what it is. But can we infringe on people's personal right to do that or not? Yeah,
and usually they are mandated for things like school attendance,
right,
for example. So again, when you say mandate, we're not talking about government goons stop. Anti-vaxxers very much have these sort of persecution fantasies. There was an anti-vaccine illustrator by the name of David Dees who had all these conspiracy theory artwork. Talented illustrator, but talking about lizard people type stuff. But one of them was this is pre-pandemic, of Jewish policemen grabbing a woman and taking her baby away from her and vaccinating against their will. And there's actually, I found some old anti-vaccine cartoons from 100 years ago, the same thing, where there's a policeman stopping a guy on the street and a doctor injecting him against her will. So
why does it have to be a Jewish policeman? Like, you guys aren't police. I don't think I've ever seen a Jewish policeman in my life. Never.
There are a few. One of my cousins he ran the helicopter department at the sheriff's department.
Oh, that's kind of cool. Yeah. See, even him, he's like, I don't want to deal with speeding tickets. Let me fly around. This is way better.
So this has always been sort of the paranoid fear, the anti-establishment fear. And again, It's my contention that if vaccines were banned, a lot of these people would say that it's a suppressed miracle cure because doctors make more money treating diseases than preventing diseases.
Sure.
So I think that there's just a lot of people who are very oppositional. And if you tell me to do A, I'll do B. If you tell me to do B, I'll do A.
Yeah, certainly that exists within America specifically. I think it's a part of the American spirit.
It is
sort of disagreeableness.
It is.
And I think that's a function kind of being American.
Yeah. No. Do the opposite of what they tell you to do and call that thinking for yourself.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I'm curious as far as your personal opinion goes, like that Philadelphia case of sort of like mandatory vaccine. I guess that's probably a more proper use of that term. As far as like a judge ordered to, what did they do? Like authorities came and like took the children like CPS and then vaccinated them and then returned them to the parents?
I don't know the exact details of how it was carried out, but I do know, if you read about the Philadelphia outbreak in 1990-91, you'll read 8 children were vaccinated against their parents' will.
Right. Do you feel like personally that's unethical? Would that cross your line of like, oh, this is going too far?
Not in the middle of an outbreak where children are suffering. Again, 8 children died. I think this is kind of a coincidence that the number of children died equaled the number of children who were vaccinated against their parents' will.
Right.
But you can't, children are not property. They have rights independent of what their parents want for them. We have a huge amount of latitude to raise our children as we see fit, as we should. I don't want the government telling me what I can do with my children. But when children's lives are at stake, and most of these are not controversial. If I have a pool and let my 3-year-old swim in it unsupervised and someone sees me, my child's going to get taken away. If I don't feed them properly, my child's going to get taken away. If I let them ride in a car without a seatbelt, my child's going to get taken away. When a distant cousin of mine had a child in a car and they ran into a store to get something and they left the child in the car and they ran back out and there was a cop there and they got in trouble for that. And most people don't have any sort of problem with that, right? That we go to great lengths to prevent children from dying of these sorts of deaths and negligence.
Right.
And when children slip through the cracks of child preventative services, it's a scandal. There have been some cases here of children who have been abused to death, and a child protective service worker visited the child a month before and missed that and didn't separate the it's a horrible, catastrophic thing to do.
Yeah.
But I don't think that parents have the right to let their child die of measles.
Interesting.
That's another way that, because often this discussion is framed, should you vaccinate your children or not? And at least with COVID, for these other diseases, you can potentially hide in the herd. An unvaccinated child will probably not get measles.
Because there's enough herd immunity.
Correct. But with COVID, it's really not a question of should you vaccinate your child. It's when your child first encounters SARS-CoV-2, will they be vaccinated or not? That's really how you have to sort of frame it.
And you say after they contract it, will they go get vaccinated?
No, listen. No. Every child, there's not a child in the world who's born today who's going to avoid exposure to SARS-CoV-2 for the rest of their life.
Right.
So the question is, when they first encounter the virus, will they be vaccinated or not?
When it gets to them.
Correct.
Right.
So, but when they get their first COVID infection, will they have been vaccinated or not? So it's not really a choice between, I guess it is, but between vaccinating your kids or not, but it's, will they be protected the first time they meet the virus?
Right. I guess the question is, will they contract it through the virus itself, or will they get an immune response through the vaccine? Correct.
Everyone's going to get some immunity to SARS-CoV-2 before they die. That's
right.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And again, the vaccine is not a panacea. It's not a.
Yeah. We can get to the efficacy. I'm just curious about this point. Like, if you're like, do you feel like there should be requirements for children to do other things related to their health? No, it's fine. You can move it if you need to.
That's right.
Should children be required to do other things that are beneficial to their health? And if they aren't, be sort of like required through like either infrastructure through school or something like that to do those things?
Depends what you mean by required. I suppose I'm in favor of PE at school.
Right.
For example.
Like kids should eat well. Kids should, sleep well. They should, have, some type of physical activity, something like that. And should morbidly obese kids be seen as like child abuse in the way that letting your kid contract measles be child abuse? Do you see those things as similar or no?
No, I mean, I don't think so. Again, contagious diseases can spread throughout the community. So, obesity is not quite like that. Solving those other problems are much more difficult. One could imagine that if we had a vaccine against obesity, which is a complicated
social
condition,
issue,
that sure, if we could vaccinate our way out of heart disease and diabetes, sure, but we don't. So those conditions really aren't comparable that way.
Because the simplicity of a measles vaccine.
Sure.
And the scalability.
Sure. In other words, what would it take to, what are you going to do? Confiscate every child who's overweight and take them away from their parents?
Right.
And again, that's not what we're talking about with vaccines, either.
But if there is an outbreak, then potentially something in that vein wouldn't be unreasonable, so to speak.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what should trigger, what should trigger the government to take children and forcibly vaccinate them against their will. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I do know that children should not be allowed to die. That if a parent says, okay, I'm not going to vaccinate my child. Okay, they got measles. Okay, I'm not going to take them to the hospital.
Yeah.
If my child dies, this is what God wants. I don't think that's acceptable.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is I think that's an important note, that like the faith healing and things like that, my child contracted some curable illness, but we'll pray it away. That I think is completely unreasonable and is probably falls underneath the umbrella of child neglect or child abuse.
Right. And so everything else that we're talking about is just sort of a spectrum of that is
right.
when
does it begin to be child abuse?
Right. And
right.
When do you have the right to separate a family? And this happens with other conditions. Parents have not treated their children for diabetes. For example, they have taken them to faith healers for that, and they have died of diabetes. Before the pandemic, there was a naturopath quack who in Canada whose child I think contracted meningitis, and they refused to take their child to the hospital until it was too late, and that child died. Those parents should be
it's awful,
guilty.
Yeah. I don't know what the charge for that is, but certainly there needs to be some type of like legal recourse for parents that intentionally don't treat their children that are deathly ill.
Correct, and they may think that they're doing the right thing.
Right.
So it's not that they want to see their children suffer. They're not malicious that way. They're not torturers, but that's the effect that they had. And I don't think most people would disagree with us about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I do think the point of like in an outbreak, some type of like required vaccination for children through force, I think would probably cross my personal line. Again, I don't have children, so it's difficult to really evaluate that. I know the bond that people have with children, with their own children, is like mind bending and spiritual in a way. So I don't know if I can truly speak on it with authority, but just in my relationship with like my nieces and nephews and things like that. The idea that in an outbreak, just because they weren't vaccinated, if they were forcibly vaccinated, I think I'd be uncomfortable with that. Now, if they contracted an illness and then the illness progressed and they were still not taken to medical personnel, then I think that would cross my personal line.
Again, this has not happened in the United States in your lifetime.
Right. Yeah, this was 70s in Philadelphia.
1990s.
Oh, 90s. Okay. Yeah.
Early 1990s.
Gotcha. Yeah.
What year were you born? 94 or
96.
96. Yeah. So
just in the cutoff.
Make me feel old, man. All right. But yeah, that's the last time that has happened. But anti-vaxxers who are professional victims,
right?
RFK, comparing this to the Holocaust, just love to sort of portray themselves as these brave people standing up against the police state. Everyone wants to be a hero.
Yeah, of course.
Everyone wants to be a hero.
And fight for the disenfranchised and for the oppressed. Of course, that makes sense.
Correct.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to point out, even with that example in Philadelphia in the 90s, it was not like an entire swath of the population, which again, not to minimize like how you were saying with myocarditis, but it was 8 children, which again, personally I think is wrong. I don't think you should have forcibly done anything to the children, but it wasn't like it was the entire country taking their kids, and in no way do I think it's comparable to the Holocaust, of course. So I think it's important to make that distinction. And then as far as for adults, for someone 18 and older, as far as their personal agency to get the vaccine, where would you stand on that?
I don't think an adult has been forcibly vaccinated against their will in the past 100 years in this country. And
right.
I think probably there's not a single illness for which that would be reasonable. I mean, one could invent some sort of, hypothetical virus that is extremely dangerous, extremely contagious. Well, we have those, but, and the vaccine is 99% effective at stopping severe disease, not 100%, but is extremely effective at stopping. So I could imagine a scenario, but then how would that work practically, right? I mean,
Dart gun.
There's just no way that would ever happen, because the second anyone showed up with someone's door with the syringe in hand here in this country where everyone has an AK-47, it would be a bloodbath. So that's never going to happen. So we're kind of speculating at this point. If you could fly or swim underwater, which would you rather do?
Right.
So
I do feel like people that like in New York City, I think police officers and people that were in sort of the service through the fire department were required to get in order to serve, or they had to do testing. I don't know what the exact legislation is for that, but I know there was a lot of uproar as far as like vaccine requirements for those jobs.
Right, but that's nothing new. A lot of these jobs have had vaccine requirements. Certainly, to work in a hospital, you do.
Right.
And there are requirements that I wash my hands. Certain one of these things that we're used to. Right. None of us have any problems with the signs in restaurants that say employees must wash hands before returning to work.
Right.
And we would be appalled at a chef who said, "No, these are my hands. This is my liberty. You can't force me to wash my hands." And that's primarily cultural, because we have grown up with hand wash. And you could say this analogy breaks down on a few levels. That hand washing is completely safe. There's zero risk involved. Whereas with vaccine, the risk is close to zero, but it's not zero. And there is something. You could feel sick the next day. What if you didn't want to feel sick? So it breaks down in some ways, but we do recognize that people do not have unlimited rights to spread diseases. And a better example is this. In my hospital right now, there's a locked ward, and there has always been a locked ward, not just for psychiatric patients, but for TB patients. So some of these patients are locked up behind bars, not bars, literally, but in a locked unit for months at a time while they take their TB medications. These are people who have failed community treatment, and no one's ever. Hopefully, I'm not giving anyone any ideas to go free these people right now.
We're storming the hospital.
Yeah, but no one's ever protested this, because we recognize that people do not have an unlimited right to spread illness. If I was to get on a subway right now and cough and sneeze in people's faces, people would be very upset with me. People would probably, if I kept doing that, the police would probably eventually show up and take me to my own hospital. People recognize that we don't have the right to spread diseases as well. So exactly where you strike that balance, I don't know.
Right.
But for some of these first responders, especially early on in the pandemic when the vaccines did stop transmission of the disease, there was a stronger case to be made for that.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's, for me at least, important to note that contracting an illness is slightly different than not being vaccinated for it, even though I guess you could suggest that it's inevitable that you would contract COVID. And then obviously you would hope people would quarantine or try to separate themselves. Obviously people didn't, and intentionally some people went around spreading it, which is awful. But I guess the exception to that example is actively having TB versus potentially having COVID, I would suggest is slightly different. But fundamentally the idea that, yeah, there are some people, if you are infected with something, you cannot just be out in the population getting everyone else sick, and that it does, I would hope, infringe on my autonomy to be a healthy person for you to be walking in here with tuberculosis.
Yeah, and right now there are cops and there are firefighters and all sorts of professions. There's people in those professions who are furious about having been mandated to get a vaccine, who are alive because of that vaccine, and they probably don't even know it.
Right.
One problem with this pandemic is all of the people who died and in their last breath regretted getting the vaccine aren't here to talk about it, whereas the people who got mandated to get vaccines are here to complain and bitch and moan and whine about how their personal liberty was infringed upon. But the people who are dead, which includes several doctors who I worked with, they're not here to tell their stories anymore.
Interesting. Yeah, and I know you'd mentioned, obviously, vaccine regret, that people that didn't get vaccinated in their final moments were hoping that they had, or wish that they had, or tried to get it at that point, but at that point it would have been too late.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm sure that happens probably pretty frequently. Like if I didn't get vaccinated, I'm on my deathbed, I would be like, yeah, I wish I got this. You know what I mean? Regardless of how dumb I thought it was, 2 days before, I would want everything or anything I could get.
Yeah. Here in New York City, we saw a lot less of that. I did not see many people regret not getting their vaccine. This probably has to do with the fact that people were traumatized by what New York City went through. We probably had lower rates of vaccine refusal.
Yeah.
Also, after the first wave, I worked at Bellevue Hospital throughout the pandemic, but I was primarily not involved with the care of COVID patients after the summer of 2020 rather. So probably there were more people there who regretted not getting the vaccine that I didn't see, but certainly intensive care doctors throughout the country all have stories of people who regret not getting the vaccine on their deathbed, especially during the Delta wave. That when it really seemed to that variant affected younger people much more than any other, and hundreds of thousands of Americans potentially lost their lives due to vaccine refusal. If this was a terrorist or a foreign government who did this, we would be up in arms about it. It would be Pearl Harbor, 9/11, all of these things times 100. But because it was a virus,
right? I would say the difference is, let's say there's a terrorist at a shopping mall that's shooting people, and people say, I'm still going to go in there. And then they chose to get shot, and then they walked in and they got shot. That would be the difference to me. And I don't know if people would be in an uproar because of that, because they would say, you chose to walk in. And I feel like it's a similar analogy with COVID, where people are choosing, and I guess this is the fundamental question when it comes to adults, is do people have the personal autonomy to kill themselves?
Well, they do, but I think a lot of these people were misled.
Right.
That they were told that the virus was only dangerous for grandma. They were told that the vaccine had these catastrophic side effects. And unfortunately, it was my profession, other doctors, who kind of led the way. And that's what I've been writing about. All of my writing specializes on misinformation spread by doctors, not people like RFK Jr.
Right. Yeah. Can you speak to some of the rhetoric as it came with the vaccine coming out saying, it's 95% effective at, stopping COVID or whatever that means, and then kind of the language changing over time to it'll help, but it won't stop transmission and things like that, and sort of how the rhetoric sort of created a framework for people's trust to kind of be eroded.
Yeah, so I don't think the rhetoric changed as much as the facts changed. Because the original trials, they were as good trials as you'll ever see done in medicine. So when people said, in this trial, the vaccine was 95% effective at stopping COVID, that was true. And that would still be true today, presumably, had there not been any variants.
Right.
I do think some people got ahead of their skis and said vaccines were definitely going to end the pandemic, for example.
Right.
And I'm very critical of these doctors, because these are doctors who minimized COVID throughout. And as soon as vaccines came out, they said, they're 100% effective at stopping severe disease, again, which was close to true in the trials. But the virus was so new, the vaccine technology was so new. I look back on my tweets and what I was saying in 2021, 2 years ago, right after the vaccines came out, and I happily, I'm going to pat myself on the back here, said things like, I think these vaccines are going to stop transmission, but I'm not sure. So I'm still going to wear a mask when I treat COVID patients and on the subway train.
How grateful were you when you look back on the tweets and you're like, whew, thank goodness I said I think.
Well, listen, that's you. I was grateful, but I was also, again, patting myself on the back, because you just have to take a cautious approach to these sorts of things. Again, we are still, in 2019, a study came out that measles wipes out the immune response. So in other words, my point is that we are still learning things about viruses that have been here for ages. And it also came out during the pandemic, as I alluded to before, that MS is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, not just the Epstein-Barr virus. But so in other words, we're still learning things about these viruses that have been with us for as long as there have been people, as long as we can tell, as long as recorded history.
Right.
And so my position, which I just got done saying now, sort of about what are the consequences of repeat infections, that we just have to be potentially humble. So when these vaccines had been out for 5 or 6 months, I was just a little cautious, and I did not say, I guarantee this vaccine is going to stop transmission, it's going to end the pandemic, that 2 vaccinated people can be safely together and have zero risk. And a lot of the doctors who I'm critical of in my writing were very, very much overselling the vaccines. Now, some of these doctors are now the ones saying, oh, the vaccines were oversold, this was misinformation. So
right. That's the rhetoric I'm talking about. Like those doctors that are suggesting that, oh, the vaccine is going to save everyone and it's a panacea and it's the end of COVID. Now we know was not necessarily the case. And some people kind of believe that. And then I think as the truth came out, the people that believed that first message and then saw the second message suggesting, like, oh, no, COVID is still real and the vaccines are helping, but it's not like it's a panacea. That is where like the trust, I think, kind of got eroded. Is from the over-exaggeration, overzealousness of the vaccine efficacy.
Correct. But it was primarily the doctors who have sowed doubt throughout the pandemic. So it was the same doctors who oversold it who are now being critical of doctors who oversold it.
Right.
I'll give you an example. So one of the doctors who I write about is a health economist at Stanford by the name of Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who was one of the authors of this document called the Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated for the purposeful mass infection of hundreds of millions of unvaccinated young Americans in the hopes of achieving herd immunity. Anyways, in April 2021, the vaccines had been out for about 6 months at that time. Dr. Anthony Fauci continued to advocate that people take precaution, even vaccinated people take precautions against COVID, because I think he rightly thought like me, or I thought like him, that everything is new and we don't really know exactly how these are going to behave over the long term, et cetera. Anyways, so Dr. Bhattacharya called Anthony Fauci America's #1 anti-vaxxer because he felt that by not promoting these vaccines as this universal panacea, he was underselling them and he was decreasing the motivation for people to get vaccines, et cetera. So a lot of the doctors who are now furious that the vaccines were oversold and were promised to stop transmission 2 years ago were livid at anyone who was underselling the vaccines or was not overselling them, for example.
Right. And what would his, method of intentional infection, what would that look like?
So he promoted this document. This was written on October 4th, 2020. It was called the Great Barrington Declaration because it was signed in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. It was written by him, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, another a vaccine scientist at Harvard at the time, Martin Kulldorff, and an epidemiologist at Oxford, Sunita Gupta. It was written under the watchful eyes of a man by the name of Jeffrey Tucker, who was sort of an anarcho-capitalist type, who, and it's going to sound like I'm making this up, but who is overtly pro-child labor. In 2016, he wrote an article called Let the Kids Work, which advocated children dropping out of school and working at Walmart and Chick-fil-A. He is also overtly pro-child smoking. He thinks that smoking is cool and teenagers can smoke when they're teens and quit by the time they get to be 30 and are early 20s and not do any damage. He doesn't believe cigarettes are addicting. Anyways, so they produced this document, which essentially had 2 parts. Number 1 was getting rid of all measures to control the virus for the vast majority of the population, ending all lockdowns, all school closures, et cetera, which were kind of on their way out anyway, at least a lot of those when it was starting to be written, and simultaneously protecting the vulnerable. So just completely locking down and shutting down nursing homes and elderly people living at home, for example. The idea is that you could completely wall off these 2 worlds, which is easier said than done. And in one world, you would have pure COVID. In your world, you'd have pure COVID. And in the world of vulnerable people, you would have zero COVID. Once 250 million Americans, none of whom were vaccinated at that time, contracted COVID. They believe that one infection led to permanent immunity. And they claim, and it's still up on their website on the Great Barrington Declaration, that herd immunity would arrive in 3 to 6 months. The pandemic would be over, that is their language, not mine, and vulnerable people could emerge from their cocoon and the pandemic would be over. yes, some people would suffer and die, but much less than otherwise. And the economy would be saved and everything would be sort of a historical blip.
I mean, that sounds pretty cool.
It does, doesn't it?
I kind of like that theory.
Right. But using those ideas, you could solve any problem. For example, here's how you solve crime. Ready? Lock up the bad guys.
It's a good idea.
Yeah, right.
We should do that.
Here's how you solve homelessness. Build homes. I mean, I'm just sort of saying, any problem can be solved just by, if you assume that all of humanity is going to march in lockstep with you, for example.
Right.
And then, what was their plan to protect vulnerable people at home? It was about 4 sentences long. It was arrange food delivery for people at home, things like that. And sure, that doesn't sound so bad, but there's a big difference between saying, feed vulnerable people at home and actually getting food into the homes of vulnerable people.
Right.
So they made very difficult, impossible things sound very, very, very easy. And they remain anti-vaccine for children. And they were very influential. They had already met with President Trump in the Oval Office in August of 2020, and he echoed their talking points. They influenced Ron DeSantis. They advised him. And a matter of fact, right before Florida's dramatic, horrible summer Delta wave, August 2021, they falsely told Floridians that the vulnerable had been protected. So there's a quote from Dr. Jay Bhattacharya at the very end of July 2021 saying, "We have protected the vulnerable by vaccinating the older population." And within days, early August 2021, the Delta wave was just devastating Florida hospitals. And 2 weeks after Jay Bhattacharya said Florida had protected the vulnerable, its deaths peaked to the highest of the pandemic. So they just were a fountain of misinformation, fake statistics, fake predictions. They drastically underestimated COVID at the start of the pandemic, predicting that it would kill 20 to 40,000 people. They just underestimated it throughout.
Were their statistics outright fraudulent, or were they sort of drawing conclusions that weren't substantiated?
Both. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, they treated the virus as a very well-known, predictable sort of thing, even though it was brand new. It had just washed up on our shores. They definitely spread a lot of fake statistics, such as saying that the flu killed more children than COVID. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya said that in summer of 2021. And by that point in the pandemic, COVID had killed about 1,000 children, whereas 1 child died of the flu in the past year. So mitigation measures that dented COVID completely wiped out the flu. There's one flu strain which actually is completely gone from the world due
to lockdown.
I think so, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so...
Was he saying that it was that year's flu versus...
He said the flu killed more children last year than COVID, even though the number was like 1,000 to 1 at that point. So just blatantly false statistics.
Right. I wonder if he was comparing last year's flu to this year's COVID.
Potentially he was, but even that's not an apples to apples comparison.
Sure, yeah, there's probably issues with that.
Well, sure, because in 2019, everything was wide open. No one was wearing masks.
Right.
So the only apples to apples comparison is when the pandemic started. And thus far, COVID has killed 10 times more children than the flu has.
Right. Yeah. I don't know necessarily the flu statistics, but that's an interesting point. So do you disagree with the declaration theoretically, or is it just in practicality, or both?
Well, they're related. You can't separate the two, right? Like if I tell you my idea of getting rid of crime is to lock up all the bad guys, right? Do you disagree with that? Well, no, I suppose, but it'd be, people don't come with labels, bad guy, not bad guy, right? And it was a fantasy, and it was never meant to be taken seriously. For example, one of the pediatric vaccine randomized controlled trials of just about 2 to 3,000 children. This was the most standard randomized controlled trial one could do. It was 460 pages of dense policies and procedures, right? This is the kind of serious document that serious scientists produce when they actually intend for their plan to be put into action. These guys were calling for one of the largest logistical challenges in the history of medicine, or in the history of the world, right? To completely identify and wall off vulnerable people from not vulnerable people. And what were their instructions on how to do it? 4 sentences here and there.
Right.
And they made a lot of claims that turned out to be false, that for people less than 70, COVID is a benign disease. They were certain that one infection led to permanent immunity, for example. And so you can't really separate the theoretical from the real. Right. They became cheerleaders for the virus, writing very positive articles about it. They almost, I describe them as defense attorneys for the virus, defending it against claims that it's dangerous or something to be avoided. They wrote articles called The Triumph of Natural Immunity, and they spoke about that young people almost had an obligation to go out and contract COVID. So one of the authors likened it to soldiers marching to war. He said, your grandfather probably fought in World War II. He went and did his duty, and it was much more dangerous than what we're asking you to do. But you have a similar obligation to contract COVID to help us gain herd immunity. And so they spoke about it as a moral obligation. And not too many people, I think, were willing to do this. I don't think too many people, when this document was produced in October 2020, were like, hey, I'm going to go get COVID. It's my moral duty. Everyone knew vaccines were just around the corner. And indeed, 2 months later, vaccines arrived. So I think everyone wanted the herd to be available for them, but they didn't want to be part of the herd.
And that's why you believe they wrote this document, because inevitably these people, they seem qualified and they seem smart, from Stanford and MIT and Oxford. I mean, I have no reason to question their pedigree. So I'm curious, why would they promote something that you feel is so intentionally fallacious?
So they are smart and they are credentialed and they can speak in scientific jargon and they can make their position sound very, very reasonable. And some of it was very reasonable when they talked about the harms of lockdowns or the harms of school closures. That was very real. I don't know of anyone who claims that those mitigation measures had no side effects. People had their, and I want to admit, I was sheltered from them. My kids didn't go to school for a year, but I never missed a paycheck. I never was worried about missing a paycheck. I was never lonely. I didn't have my entire social network ripped out from me in a heartbeat. So I want to recognize that sort of thing. So their document provided cover to anyone who wanted to get rid of all mitigation measures to control the pandemic. So part of it was meant to be taken very seriously. And because they spoke about the harms of lockdowns so well, they were able to convince a lot of people.
And how did they personally benefit? Was there like a financial incentive, or was it just to gain public support? So
I don't know. There are some shady business dealings. As I mentioned, a lot of this was sponsored by this anarcho-capitalist type by the name of Jeffrey Tucker, who now runs something called the Brownstone Institute, which has become one of the world's biggest purveyors of medical misinformation. But there are these sort of think tanks that are funded by Koch brothers. I sound a little conspiracy theory myself, but I do think there was a sort of network out there designed to convince people. You said for yourself that you heard that through the ether that COVID was totally benign for young people, and that was part of their messaging as well.
Right. Yeah, or I guess to the idea that it was rare if something were to happen, like the odds of you getting sick are so low that, just go kind of get it and it's fine. And I don't know, to me at my age, when it happened, I was like probably 23. This was 3 years ago. In my mind, I was like, I'm pretty healthy. I'd rather not get it, but I don't really want to like put my whole life on pause. So I'm going to like try to be smart and wash my hands. But if I do get it, then that's fine. And I ended up contracting it before any vaccine was available, and I had 3 days. And it was like a normal story. I think that most people, obviously the vast majority of young people have. So again, I understand the trolley problem there, where it's like, you can wait for it, but then how long do you delay things? And do we know that the vaccine will come out and be safe and effective in that time period? I don't know necessarily what people within academic circles knew. As someone in just a layperson in society, to me, it felt like oh, this vaccine's never coming. And if it is, who knows how safe it's going to be, because it was rushed in Operation Warp Speed and everything else. So when it does come out, will anyone want to take it? So should the young people just go get infected? And some of them obviously will die, and some of them will have comorbidities and co-founders that will then make them predisposed to dying at a higher rate, which is unfortunate, obviously. But to that point, that notion at the time, to me at least, wouldn't have sounded crazy. Obviously, in hindsight, knowing with the efficacy of the vaccine and when it came out, that's different. But yeah, I'm curious. In that moment, I didn't read it when it came out, but had I read it, I don't know if I would have objected on a lot of grounds.
Because it made it all sound so simple, right? All we have to do is feed older people at home, So
right.
when asked about it a year later, Dr. Bhattacharya said we could have used DoorDash. So
Right.
he never really gave it any serious thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they never produced a 460-page document about how to actually feed older people. Who's going to deliver the food? What happens if that person gets sick? What if they turn out to be scammers? There were a lot of those during the course of the pandemic.
Sure.
The proof is in the pudding that nowhere in the world enacted their plan to achieve herd immunity in 3 to 6 months.
Right. Now, had they come up with some type of because that is no longer like a medical issue, it's like a logistics issue. Like, are we able to, I guess it's obviously, if some of the logistical people involved get sick, then it becomes a medical issue. But if they were potentially able to come up with some type of proposal that, maybe it was expensive, but it was some type of like government subsidized program to provide food for people and some type of housing program for people that were infected to be able to go and quarantine, and some type of medical system that people could go take care of them. If they had proposed that and it seemed somewhat feasible, would that change your perspective on their position at all?
So that's a big if, number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, their plan also required that everyone think like you, that every non-vulnerable person be willing to contract COVID in the fall
Right.
of 2020. So it assumed that all of humanity marched in lockstep with their conditions.
Right. And you can't require someone to go out and get it.
They weren't talking
not
about
fair.
requiring it, but they assumed that everyone just would.
Right.
So people sometimes say, we never really tried the Great Barrington Declaration. And I say we did, because it was published. People had hundreds of millions of Americans on October 4th had the option to go out and get COVID to lead life normally. And most didn't, very few did.
Oh, really? But most people didn't go out and contract it in October?
No, October 2020, no. Hundreds of millions of Americans did not say, well, I'm done with quarantine. I'm just going to go out and live my life and go to bars and get COVID.
Oh, interesting.
But that's...
Is that a personal, or is that like statistic? I feel like in most of the country, at least for me personally, I obviously growing up in Florida, most of the people I knew in Florida never locked down. And obviously there were high death rates and people got it and some people recovered and it did what it did. And I feel like in most of the country, most people by that time were like,
October 2020?
Maybe.
Before anyone was vaccinated, you might be holding,
Yeah, I mean, this might be a bias
if you
for
were
growing up in Florida.
23 and only hanging out with 23.
That was my circle.
Right. So you could be right about that. But, a lot of 40 and 50 and 60,
Right. That's a different story.
did not.
Right.
And again, their position may have made sense in a world without vaccines. For example, my mother sent me to a chickenpox party when I was a kid because she knew correctly that chickenpox is a relatively mild disease for children, not totally harmless, and it's a dangerous disease when you get it as an adult. So and one infection leads to immunity, and there was no vaccine. So if you have those 4 conditions, benign in childhood, one infection leads to permanent immunity, and no vaccines, then yeah, you should probably try to have people get this disease when they're children rather than adults. But COVID, really the only box that it ticks off is that it's milder in children than adults, but it doesn't lead to permanent immunity. And everyone knew in October 2020 that the vaccine results were going to be announced very soon, and they were.
Right.
And 2 months later, the first vaccines were given out in December of 2020.
Right.
And it's just this fantasy that you can totally separate vulnerable from not vulnerable people.
Yeah.
That was... They made it sound like it would be easy to just wall off 70 million vulnerable Americans from not vulnerable Americans.
Right. Yeah, that'd be tricky. My sister is 20 something and lives with my parents who see her parents, and they're all they're all connected. And so I understand why that creates a challenge.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot more to this issue that we could get into, the pharmaceutical industry and all of that stuff. But all in all, I really appreciate you sitting down and chatting with me. I know you got to run. But this was hugely informative, and I really appreciate you being honest and open to answering all my questions.
I could talk about this stuff for hours, and we did. And it felt like 10 minutes went by.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it so much. Thank you. We'll do this again sometime. You. This was excellent.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.